Magic Betrayed. Rise of the Arcanist, Book 1, A More Than Magic Serial, by Elizabeth Kirke. Read by Starla Huchton. Chapter 1. Jen. Dear Rachel, can you believe the first 90 days of my internship are almost over? I'll move from a stipend to a salary, which means you can stop sending me money, although I appreciate it, and start accruing vacation time. I want to thank you again for being so supportive of my move. You're the best stepmom ever. Especially because I know you think I came to New York for all the wrong reasons. Why else would I get a master's in history, then turn around and get an internship at a security company you've never heard of in another state, where my boyfriend just happens to work? It's hard to explain. Okay, maybe not that hard. I'm a witch. I know, not the explanation you were expecting, but it's the truth. There's so much I want to tell you. So much I wish I could tell you. Mar. I watched a flame flare to life at the corner of the letter. The paper curled and blackened as the fire moved along, destroying the words I had written. As I watched it burn, I told myself the tears in my eyes were just from the smoke. When nothing was left but ash, I aimed my wand at it again. On. The ashes sailed lazily through the air as I directed them to the fireplace and dropped them in. A black furry head popped up from the cat tree on the hearth. Rack stood and stretched, watching the ashes float by. He took a step toward me and jumped off the perch. He vanished the moment his feet left the ground, leaving only a few wisps of smoke in his wake. A moment later, he appeared above the couch and landed next to me, as gracefully as if he jumped a couple of feet instead of across an entire room. As more smoke drifted down around him, he curled his inky tail over his feet and watched me with unblinking yellow eyes. "What were you writing?" he asked, tilting his head a bit. "A letter to my stepmom." A sense of sympathy and understanding passed through our bond. He stretched out and bumped his head gently against my arm. I scratched him behind the ears, feeling the pleasant sensation behind my own as I did. "I thought it would be easier like this," I confessed. "I had to lie to Rachel so much when I was living at home, but now everything she knows about my life is a freaking lie." "She knows you live with Thomas." Honestly, Rack, that's the one thing I wish I had lied about. Half of the reason Rachel's upset I'm here is because she thinks I'm doing it just to be with Thomas. Sure, it was nice to finally move in together after 5 years of dating long distance, but he was a perk of moving, not the reason. For one thing, I had several close friends here, all of them magical beings like me. I had met a few magics over the years, but never got as close to them as I was to this group. It was probably something about facing an evil vampire together, not long after I first met them. My friendships usually weren't forged out of a shared fear of death experience. Not that I could explain that to Rachel, especially not when I made the mistake of telling her Thomas worked for the same company I was applying for an internship with. After getting a master's in history, another lie, Rachel couldn't understand why I'd want to work for a little company like ME Security. She said it bothered her that I could talk about what I learned in history class for hours, but couldn't muster the same enthusiasm about Mez for even a few minutes. That was because I had no idea what the company did, or rather, what they were supposed to do. It was all a cover presented to non-magics, like Rachel, who took an interest in them. Their website looked like, and probably was, something out of the 90s, and was maddeningly unhelpful. It looked, as Rachel pointed out, like some sort of scam company. It not only worried her even more, but it made her paranoid about Thomas's morals as well. I certainly couldn't tell her that MES actually stood for Magical Enforcement and Secrecy. It was, in a way, somewhat security-related, at least. The classes I claimed were for an advanced history degree were actually magic classes I was taking at our local MES office. Thanks to my magic coming from my biological mother's side, nobody knew I was a witch until I met Thomas and the others. It put me behind other witches my age, so I took the classes to build my skills and learn things about my new world that I would have known had my mother been around to teach me. Working for MES would give me a leg up, no matter what I chose to do. If a magic didn't work directly for MES, sooner or later they worked with them in some way. In fact, all of my friends worked for MES. We were in different departments, but it was fun to get to spend time with them. The biggest downside was that Thomas and our roommate worked the night shift together. Once my internship was finished, I'd probably switch to that shift as well, but for now, I was stuck with whatever I got. It meant that Thomas and T.S. were often getting home as I was leaving. I couldn't be too upset, though. I still got to see them far more than I did while living in Maryland. In addition to his regular duties working for MES, Thomas also doubled as a special agent. Special agents were called in for the really dangerous stuff: feral werewolves, murderous vampires, out-of-control elementals, and things like that. I sometimes wished I told Rachel that Thomas did something other than boring office work. It would have given me someone else to talk to on nights he was late, and I worried he was out on a dangerous job, especially when some of my other friends were out too. T.S. was a field agent, which meant he was always sent out first. Our friend Danny was a special agent and nearly always out on a job with Thomas. And then there was Charlie, who was just an agent, but was still on call for problems that required a fire elemental or needed as many people as possible. Maybe I should have waited to... I trailed off with a sigh. No, I didn't regret coming to New York at all. Staying wouldn't have changed the fact I'd still have to lie to Rachel, and the longer I stayed, the more I'd have to make up. She'd start wondering why I was still long distance with a guy I hardly saw, one she thought she had yet to meet. She'd never understand that we weren't in a rush. 5 years was a blink of an eye for a magic. Charlie and Danny had been engaged for that long now, with no wedding date in sight, after dating for nearly 25. Thomas and I weren't in a hurry. If nothing else, at least my stepmother understood that I wanted to be closer to him. But then, if I had opted for a magic job in Maryland, she'd ask all sorts of questions I couldn't dodge in person. And I'd have to get a job. Sooner or later, a 27-year-old bumming around at home would concern her as much as me leaving had. I couldn't linger there anyway. I could still pull off my real age, but the truth was I stopped aging not long after I started using magic. In another 5 years, I might be able to pull off 32 and looking good, but not for much longer than that. Once that started to happen, I'd have to slowly withdraw from my non-magic family. Immortality had its drawbacks. With another sigh, I stood. There was no need to dwell on it. I wasn't happy knowing I'd be forced to limit contact with Rachel and my sister someday, but I had it better than some. My friends were like one big family. I had a steady job. Well, internship, with plenty of opportunity to grow. I had my familiar. And, of course, I was a witch. That was pretty damn great. Even my non-magic cousin had been turned into a dampier. She'd be in my life no matter what now. Thomas lost his parents and familiar to vampires during a massacre at his high school decades ago. T.S. was too young to remember it well, but he had been in first grade there and nearly died. In fact, most of my friends had experienced some level of trauma in their lives. Even I lost my father young and grew up thinking my biological mother abandoned me. Never mind a few recent brushes with death since becoming a magic. Still, I kissed Rack's dark fur and he purred. No regrets. I grabbed my half-forgotten dinner plate and carried it into the kitchen. It was the most updated and finest room in the old farmhouse. Thomas, T.S., and Danny had owned it for nearly 40 years. Danny moved out long ago, but practically still lived here. At least, it felt like it sometimes. The big house always served as a gathering place for our group of friends, and old habits die hard, especially when you're immortal. Well, older immortals, maybe. I was already thinking of it as my house, although part of that was Thomas and T.S., making sure I felt at home. Just as I started getting lost in a book, my cell phone rang. It was Lynn, my biological mother. She was attacked and changed into a vampire not long after I was born, which left her hospitalized for a month while the turning process completed. Her relationship with my father was strained, mainly because she was a witch and hadn't been able to get a permit to tell him about magic. When he came home to find his baby daughter alone and his wife gone, he assumed she left on purpose. After that, he raised me alone until he met Rachel, who just happened to be the aunt of my best friend. Then he passed away, just a couple of years later. Rachel was really the only parent I had ever known, and I thought she was the best mom ever, which made it tough to suddenly have Lynn drop back into my life. Over the last few years, the two of us had built more of a friend or sisterly relationship than a mother-daughter one, which I was fine with. The hard part was that since Lynn was a magic, I was able to be honest with her about everything, while I was forced to keep lying to my stepmom. Since I couldn't even tell Rachel that Lynn was around, it made the lies even harder sometimes. Nevertheless, when I got off the phone, I was feeling better. It was nice to not worry about keeping my story straight and just talk for a bit, especially when Thomas was at work and someone could share my concern that he'd been sent on a dangerous job. I was feeling hungry, so I started browsing the fridge for a late-night snack. I sensed surprise through my bond with Rack just before I heard the sound of the front door closing. Someone was talking with Rack, and I quickly identified Thomas's voice. "You're home early?" I said, successfully finding some salsa that would go bad soon. I opened it and took a whiff. Seemed fresh. I closed the fridge and turned to see Thomas behind me, offering a bag of chips, with half a smirk. He brushed a lock of brown hair off his forehead, away from his eyes. "Thank you," I said, taking the bag from him. Don't eat that, he advised, nodding to the salsa. It smells okay. I took another sniff. He shook his head in disagreement, so I shrugged. I trusted his sense of smell over mine. If you say so. He grinned and held up a new container of salsa. Grabbed this, too. I laughed and hugged him, careful not to smash the chips. He was taller than me, but not by too much. It was just enough that he could give me a hello kiss on the cheek without having to stoop. He hugged me back. I fit comfortably under his arm, with my ear snug against his shoulder and my head tucked under his chin. Are you home for the night? I asked as I pulled away. Yeah, I finished up everything I needed to do and didn't have much else going on. Stopped for a pint and then figured I'd head home. T.S.? He's still at work. His green eyes narrowed in concern. That missing wizard case. Oh. My stomach gave a nervous flop at the reminder. A wizard had gone missing a couple of weeks ago. He was just the latest in a string of disappearances that stretched back to before my internship started. Years before, if you believed the rumors. Several cases had been linked to the same place, and now people were starting to get worried. How was work? Slow. Thomas chuckled. Then a small frown creased his brows. I had to have a chat with Charlotte today. Charlotte. The name was familiar, but it took me a second to connect it to the other intern at Mez. She was in the IT department, so I rarely crossed paths with her. Most of what I knew about her was second-hand from Ember, my friend who worked in IT. Even then, Charlotte tended to keep to herself. What I did know was that she had been changed into a Dampier only a few months ago. Only a witch or wizard could be turned into a vampire. If a vampire turned a non-magic, they became a Dampier, which were essentially vampires, albeit not as powerful, but still quite a bit stronger and faster than humans. The biggest difference was Dampiers lacked the ability to turn people. I knew firsthand how overwhelming it was to suddenly discover magic was real and try to navigate a shocking new world. I couldn't imagine what it was like to have the added complication, not to mention stress, of having to drink blood and finding out I wasn't human anymore. Understandably, Charlotte was still having some trouble adapting. As a non-magic, she was a skilled computer programmer, which was a sorely needed job skill among magics, so Mez jumped at the chance to create an internship just for her when she expressed interest. Is she okay? I asked. He wouldn't be telling me they had a talk if it were just a casual conversation. He sighed and shrugged as he eased himself onto a stool by the counter. I joined him in concern, setting the chips and salsa down as I sat. She is now, I guess, he said. I got an alert she wasn't signed up for enough feedings this month, and it's not the first time, so I figured I should probably talk with her. Thomas's job at Mez was another one of those things that I couldn't get very detailed about with Rachel. I wasn't sure what a community liaison like him would be doing at what was supposed to be a security company. Thomas dealt with all the magics in the area, residents and visitors alike, to make sure that their magical needs were being met. Among those duties was handling the blood donor schedule for vampires and Dampiers. Feeding without permission was illegal, as was feeding from non-magics. While vampires could, and did, drink bagged blood, roughly a third of what they drank had to be straight from the source, so to speak, Otherwise, they'd get sick or worse. They also needed a wide variety. Only human blood worked, which cut out a large percentage of magics who may have been willing to donate. I was sure that some lucky vampires may have had enough of a human network to provide ample blood, but I doubted that someone relatively new to our world, like Charlotte, had that luxury. As an added perk, if you could call it that, the schedule allowed Mez to know exactly when and where vampires would be feeding. It made it easy to track them. If a vampire were to turn someone else into a vampire or a dhampir, which was a crime punishable by death, it would make it incredibly difficult to try and secretly integrate them into our world because using the blood drives would immediately raise red flags. Assuming that Charlotte did not have a bunch of personal donors, the fact she wasn't on the schedule often enough meant that she was either underfed and potentially in danger of making herself sick, or she was feeding from innocent people without permission, not just against the law, but also punishable by death. The magic world didn't tend to be very forgiving of vampires.
She didn't seem very thrilled about it,
Thomas continued.
We had a little chat about how much blood she should actually be getting versus what she is, and I, tried to feel her out a little bit and make sure that she's not feeding from anyone she shouldn't be.
Do you think that's the case? I asked in concern. He shook his head.
No, it seems like she just genuinely isn't into it. Can't really blame her for that. It's hard, especially if you don't even know vampires exist to begin with.
I nodded in agreement. I remembered how hard adapting to feeding had been for Shannon, and she was a huge fan of vampire books and things when she was a non-magic. I used the lull in the conversation to open the chips and salsa, trying not to think too hard about how my cousin's transition to life as a magic had started out. Shannon had been able to lean on my friends and I as she adjusted. I doubted Charlotte had gotten that sort of support. Do you think maybe Charlotte could use a friendly face? I offered. I could sign up. He wrinkled his nose.
I don't think that would be necessary.
You know, I was a blood donor in Maryland, I reminded him.
I wasn't thrilled about it then, either. Besides, I wasn't the one responsible for actually putting your name on the schedule.
It was sweet, if not slightly overprotective. I rolled my eyes fondly at him. How many people are actually hurt by vampires during blood drives?
Not many, he grudgingly admitted. You know I'm the last person who holds those stupid prejudices about vampires, but...
He shrugged.
It's not all entirely untrue. Not a lot of blood donors get hurt, but it happens, and I would be pretty upset if it happened to you.
Maybe, I teased gently, you're just afraid that I'm going to end up meeting some cute vampire guy.
You got me.
Thomas laughed.
That's exactly what I'm worried about. Or at least I would be if I wasn't the one doing the scheduling, he added.
So maybe I need to check that schedule and make sure you're not giving yourself any cute wishes, I countered. I dunked a chip in the salsa and took a big bite, as if I was done talking.
Worried about that, are you?
Should I be? Quick as lightning, he spun the top of my stool partway around so I was facing away from him. He gave it a tug, yanking me off balance, and I fell back against him. Before I could even think about adjusting myself, he wrapped one arm around my chest, pulling me tightly to him. With his other hand, he brushed my hair off my neck and caught it up in a loose ponytail, then tugged gently to urge my head to the side. He paused, just a beat, so that my brain could catch up with what was happening. Then, slowly and deliberately, he dragged his tongue up the side of my jugular. I couldn't resist a shiver.
"Tell me,"
he breathed in my ear.
"do you honestly think there are any cute witches you need to be worried about?"
I sighed contentedly and arched my neck up to him. I suppose not. His chest vibrated against my back as he chuckled while nuzzling my neck. I felt him inhale, followed by a shudder. "Regretting stopping for that pint?" I asked. He nipped me gently.
"I have plenty of room for dessert."
I could almost see his expression before he even pulled away. I turned partially, and, sure enough, he was wincing with embarrassment.
"Was that over the line?"
he asked. I thought it was very clever, I told him. And, kind of romantic, in a vampire-y way.
"I think the word is vampiric."
"Shouldn't you know?" I teased. Instead of answering, he plucked the forgotten chip from my hand and popped it in his mouth. "There's garlic on that." Thomas snorted.
"Don't you start with that nonsense. I get enough crap from Danny."
I chuckled, and our eyes met for a moment. "I love you," I blurted. He grinned at me, then eased my stool back onto all four legs.
"You are something else, Jen."
He said it with a fond smile. It was a phrase he frequently used to express his disbelief at stumbling upon a witch who didn't run screaming from him. I supposed there was a plus side to being raised as a non-magic and enjoying a good vampire romance novel now and again, certainly better than the witches who were raised to hate them. He brushed a lock of hair back off my cheek, green eyes gazing into mine.
"I love you too."
Then his nostrils flared.
"Were you burning a candle?"
"No, why?"
"You smell vaguely smoky."
Oh, now it was my turn to be embarrassed. "I was burning paper." Thomas just regarded me skeptically, and I knew he wasn't going to leave that one alone. I sighed. I was writing a letter to Rachel and kind of got carried away and started writing stuff that, I can't tell her. So I set it on fire. It didn't take him very long to figure out what stuff I was implying. Keeping our existence a secret from non-magics was our number one most important law. It was also pretty much the reason Mez had been founded. It was possible to apply for a permit to tell non-magics about us, but the process was lengthy and complicated, and my odds of approval weren't very good. Since Rachel was my stepmother and I was an adult, at least by non-magic standards, she had a very slim chance of getting a permit. I had a better shot with my little half-sister, Emily, since she was at least biologically related to me. Not that it mattered. I would never be able to apply for a permit for either of them. As if he had read my mind, Thomas bowed his head and looked away from me, unable to meet my eyes.
"I'm sorry,"
he said heavily.
"Jen, I'm so—"
I put my finger over his lips, knowing he was apologizing for far more than just the fact I wanted to tell Rachel and couldn't. "Don't be sorry," I said firmly. You saved Shannon's life. That's worth more than a permit. Don't ever be sorry about that. Got it?" He kissed the tip of my finger and nodded solemnly before one corner of his mouth twisted into a weak smile.
"I'm still sorry, though,"
he added softly. I leaned forward and rested my head against his chest with a sigh. A few years ago, my cousin Shannon, still a non-magic, had nearly died. Thomas was forced to make the split-second decision to save her life by turning her. The daring move had worked, but it also meant that if anyone ever found out what Thomas had done, he'd be executed, no questions asked. Since a truth potion was part of the process for applying for a permit, I could never, ever risk it. Being able to tell Rachel and Emily about magic wasn't worth trading Thomas's life for. But not being able to apply for those permits was still really tough sometimes, especially when it came to being forced to lie to Rachel about my life. Thomas wrapped his arms around me. We sat like that silently for some time. It felt so good, so right, that I could practically feel myself falling asleep, lulled by the comforting sound of his 3 steadily beating hearts. A normal, more human heart, a larger stomach heart for holding blood, and a heart-like organ for filtering blood. Once, the beating had sounded quite strange to me. Now, the sound had not only become familiar, but I found that if I paid attention, I could actually hear the difference between the stomach heart beating when it was empty versus full. It sounded like he had actually gotten more than 1 pint on the way home. I yawned, and he turned the embrace into a tighter hug.
"Tired?"
"A little," I answered, "but I'd rather stay up, if you want to watch a movie or anything."
"Actually, I think I'd rather turn in early with you."
He stood and started rolling up the bag of chips, shooting me a sly look over his shoulder.
"I think there was talk of dessert,"
he teased. "I still haven't gotten ready for bed," I said. "I was thinking of showering, but..." I let it hang.
"If that's an invitation to join you, I'm going to take out the trash and be right there."
"Beat you there."
"We'll see."
I headed out of the kitchen. The upstairs bathroom, where our room was being renovated, so I headed down to the basement. The bathroom there was better than the original one upstairs anyway. Thomas's first roommate, Danny, was a water elemental, and when it comes to renovating a bathroom, water elementals seem to have their priorities in the right place. "I'm going to shower," I told Rack as I headed through the living room to the basement. "Will you be okay up here?"
"I will if you make sure to block me if Thomas is showering with you,"
he said, referring to our ability to prevent information from passing through our bond. Thanks to that bond, I could feel his amusement. "I will," I promised. He jumped off the couch and vanished. Even though I couldn't see him, I could sense exactly where he was and turned to see that he had landed on the radiator behind me. Almost immediately, I started feeling the heat from it through him.
"Go have fun,"
he purred.
"I'll be fine."
He started cleaning his paws. Nodding, I turned and carefully made my way down the steep staircase that led to the basement. I was almost to the bathroom door when the sliding glass door to the backyard opened. I sprinted, but there was no outrunning a vampire. Thomas beat me by a mile. "Cheater," I snorted, following him into the bathroom.
Jen,
Thomas groaned, stirring me from a sound sleep.
Your alarm is going off.
I fought back a yawn. Sorry. I could just barely hear my morning alarm coming from somewhere. I carefully worked my way out from under his arm, stopping to give him a quick peck on the cheek, and escaped the bed. We hadn't even made it out of the basement last night. Luckily, there was a nice big bed down here. I followed the sound to my bathroom and found my phone in the pocket of my discarded pants. After dismissing the alarm, I grabbed the nearest shirt, which turned out to be Thomas's, and pulled it on before heading up the stairs to start my coffee. I made it to the living room and stopped short. There was a huge wolf sprawled on the couch. Well, the wolf itself wasn't surprising. The shock was the ball of black fluff curled contentedly on top of it. Rack and T.S. maintained a feline-canine feud, but clearly all bets were off when it came to somewhere warm and cozy. For a moment, I stood and took in the amusing sight. T.S. was so large in his wolf form that he was practically falling off the couch. He was on his back, with all 4 legs jutting out at different angles. One paw, and the large tail dragging on the floor, were twitching slowly, like he was dreaming. His massive jaws were open wide, revealing a ferocious set of teeth and fangs bigger than my hand. The imposing picture was ruined by the large tongue comically lolling out between them. That and the cat sleeping on his chest. Chuckling to myself, I headed into the kitchen and started the coffee. The sun would probably be up soon, and T.S. would shift back. Sure enough, by the time I had the coffee brewing and returned to the living room, Rack was sleeping on a much smaller human. Not that T.S. could really be considered small, regardless of what form he was in. T.S. was still sprawled on his back with his tongue hanging out, and I bit back a laugh. He could shift with clothes, provided they were treated with a potion first, but he had obviously gone to sleep in only boxers. I supposed I was lucky he had on anything at all. It seemed T.S., well, all werewolves, so he claimed, had a tendency to forget clothing now and again. In just a few short months, I had been subjected to a fully naked roommate several times. Thomas seemed unfazed after decades of living together, so I was trying to just roll with it. Rack opened his eyes, looked around in confusion, then froze. "Morning," I teased. "Comfortable?" He slowly stood, just as T.S. rolled to his side. I sensed alarm and felt a tingle in my fingers as Rack dug in his claws for balance. T.S. yelped like a dog and jerked upright, looking around in confusion. "Bloody hell, what was that?" Sleep made his baritone voice even deeper than usual and thickened his Irish accent. "Sorry," Rack said. He had jumped to the table and was innocently licking his paws, no doubt cleaning off Wolf. T.S. examined his chest. "You scratched me," he said indignantly. In all honesty, I was impressed Rack's claws had gotten through the absurd amount of chest hair. "I said sorry," Rack repeated. "You rolled over and he lost his balance," I said in defense of my familiar. "What were you on top of me for?" T.S. asked. I sensed embarrassment. "It was cold last night, and your fur was warm," Rack admitted.
Fair enough, T.S. conceded. He grinned and arched an eyebrow at me. I'd ask why you weren't with Jen, but that's clear. I automatically reached up with one hand to cover my neck. Not that it mattered. Even if the physical evidence had already healed, they both knew. I'm going to get ready for work. I didn't need to feel embarrassed in front of them, but I did anyway. T.S. stretched and followed me. Don't mind me. I'm heading up to my room. He paused and added, You're welcome to join me, Rack, if you like. Rack nodded in thanks, and T.S. and I headed upstairs. Night, Jen, T.S. said with a chuckle as he headed into his room. The door closed, and I heard a thump as he flopped onto the gigantic beanbag he used as a bed. I stopped by the bathroom to check the mirror. Sure enough, there were several faded bruises, each with 2 scarred punctures in the middle, on my neck. I pulled off my shirt and wasn't surprised to see a few on my shoulders, too. Hazard of dating a vampire. I grabbed a healing potion from the medicine cabinet and slathered it on. Perk of being a witch. The marks would be gone long before I got to work. Chapter 2. Jen. I was right. By the time I was out on the front porch waiting for my ride, the evidence of a fun night with Thomas was gone. Rack could hear the car coming before I could and returned from a hunting jaunt in the field just as Charlie drove into view. I met him partway down the driveway and opened the back door. Rack hopped in, and I slid into the seat next to him. Morning, Charlie. Morning, Ember, I said. Good morning, they chorused. Charlie's voice was just a bit deeper, and his accent, left over from growing up on a ranch in Arizona, a bit more pronounced than Ember's. They turned around to greet me with wide, identical smiles. They could have easily passed for twins, and usually claimed that around non-magics. As it happened, Charlie was almost 30 years older than Ember. It wasn't a huge age gap for magic siblings, but they weren't siblings. Charlie was Ember's father, and it was considered an extremely small age difference for a parent and child. In fact, since he had been under 30, Charlie was still a minor by magic standards when Ember was born. It was one of those things that still made my head spin sometimes. Brought you coffee, Charlie added, handing a travel mug back to me. Thanks, I said gratefully. Really. The morning coffee Charlie always brought me was more than just a nice gesture. As a fire elemental, he didn't drink liquids. Although Ember periodically sipped hot drinks for fun, I knew she didn't make a morning pot of coffee for herself. Charlie insisted it was no problem, and he was making coffee for Danny anyway, but I knew Danny usually slept in after working the night shift. That meant Charlie was going out of his way to make me coffee, which pretty much was Charlie in a nutshell. Taking care of people was how he showed he cared. I suppose part of it was the dad in him. Not a problem, Charlie said, catching my eye in his rear-view mirror. I smiled back at his reflection. Like all elementals, his eyes changed colors with his moods, and the colors were constantly in motion. Right now, bright reds and oranges were flickering away like merry flames, licking along the edges of his irises and around his pupils. Even the whites of his eyes had a faint red tinge, although that never changed. He absently reached up and brushed his colorful hair out of his eyes as he eased the car out of the driveway. His hair started off deep, dark red at the roots, then faded out
to orange as it grew. If his hair hadn't had the tendency to curl and stick up, it probably would have been long enough to cover his ears. Ember's hair fell just below her shoulders when she straightened it, and barely brushed them when she didn't. Since hers was so much longer than Charlie's, the last couple of inches changed from orange to yellow. I knew if she grew her hair even longer, it would eventually turn white. She turned and grinned at me. "How are ya?" Unknowingly mirroring Charlie, she brushed her own hair out of her eyes, drawing my attention to her one lock of hair that stayed the same shade of scarlet from root to tip. Charlie had one in the exact same spot. "Doing good." "Aren't you almost done with your 90 days?" "Yes, just a couple more weeks." "Toasty," Ember said. "Told you it would go by fast," Charlie chuckled. "It did," I agreed. I leaned back and sipped my coffee as we headed to work. I couldn't resist smiling as Ember produced a cinnamon stick. She twirled it around in her fingers. A wisp of smoke started rising from it as she ate, fire elemental style, by burning it to absorb the nutrients. Ember flicked it, and a few ashes tumbled down. The ashes reminded me of my letter to my stepmother. For a moment, my smile faltered. Then the question of what I'd be doing right now in Maryland brought it back. Had I stayed in Maryland, I certainly wouldn't be able to spend my mornings with two of my closest friends, carpooling to a job I was starting to love. Rack purred in reaction to my emotions and kneaded my leg before curling up on the other seat. As lunch rolled around, it seemed like my day was shaping up to be a nice, routine one. Today, like most days, I was assigned to the front desk, where I was learning the general ins and outs of Mez. I transferred some calls, took some notes, and printed and distributed a bunch of stuff. Mez was a weird place to work. Of course, the different types of magical beings wandering around without worrying about concealing themselves from non-magics made it really weird. It was hard to get used to. I still jumped in surprise when rabbit familiars popped out of walls or ravens fluttered into elevators with me. And, of course, there were all manner of strange things in the break room on shelves next to what I considered normal food. Even Rack, sitting on his own comfy stool at the desk next to me, was unusual. But one of the things that made Mez really weird was the sometimes amusing, sometimes inconvenient way it incorporated technology. Some magics still had massive monitors, yellowed with age, on their desks, while others had sleek laptops. Most were happy to use the internal chat system, but some didn't even use the phones, and instead physically went to other cubicles to ask questions. Half of my job seemed to be printing and delivering things that could have just been emailed. On the other hand, it did give me a chance to get to know everyone. When it was time for my lunch break, I waited until Holly, a wood elemental who worked full-time at the front desk, arrived for her shift. As usual, she was right on time, so Rack and I headed up to the break room. Ember was already there, burning her way through a large log. A jackal familiar was munching out of a bowl of dog food in the corner, and several other people looked like they were eating non-magic food, but only one was a witch like me. The others were all just in human form, like Mariana. I sat down next to her, across from Ember, at one of the tables. "Hey, Jen, how's the front desk?" Mariana asked me. She had finished her internship not too long ago, so she knew exactly what my job entailed. She looked as human as me, In fact, she was technically human now, but add some water and she could change into her mermaid form as easily as T.S. changed into a wolf. Her blonde hair turned dark green the moment she got into water, but she could choose to keep her legs or fuse them into a tail. Faint green streaks in her hair and incredibly blue eyes were the only clue she wasn't always human. Danny had been babysitting Mariana since she was 2, so when Danny and Charlie started dating, Mariana and Ember got to spend a lot of time together. Even so, the pair had eagerly included me from the start, making my move to New York even more rewarding. "It's the front desk," I laughed. "How's accounting?" Mariana rolled her eyes.
"It'd be great if Peridot would actually let me do anything."
I groaned in sympathy, and Ember snorted. Mariana's supervisor was a stone elemental. They tended to be set in their ways, which apparently included how they operated. Mariana was struggling to get anything more than busy work in accounting. Even then, she hardly had any. Peridot still had not restructured her department in a way that accommodated a new member, and yet both Peridot and Mariana's other teammate had more than enough work to do.
"Too bad you can't show her who's boss,"
Ember said. Ember had struggled joining the all-male IT team. In spite of Charlie threatening to set them on fire for her, and Danny offering to talk with them, Ember ended up putting her considerable hacking skills to work and making life miserable until her team accepted her. It was lucky they had, too. Poor Charlotte was having enough trouble adapting to life as a damn peer without having to deal with some idiots in IT. I was glad Ember was there for her, even if she didn't seem to be reaching out.
"Elementals,"
Mariana said with a long-suffering sigh. We all laughed. Elementals did indeed have their quirks, some worse than others. After lunch, I returned to the front desk for some hands-on training with Holly on how to handle certain calls without transferring them and various procedures. In the early afternoon, I got yet another thick packet to print and deliver. This time, however, I was delighted to see I was taking it to Charlie. The novelty of being able to drop in and see my friends whenever I wanted, even for work, hadn't worn off yet. I knocked and waited for him to say I could come in. When he did, I shouldered the door open and awkwardly backed in, trying to balance the stack of papers and keep the door from swinging open too fast. "Hey, Jen," Charlie said. "Hey." Then Danny's unmistakable voice greeted me, too. I swallowed hard. I hated being caught off guard by Danny.
"Hey,"
I managed to squeak, turning around to face the entire office. Charlie was sitting at his desk, and Danny was in the guest chair across from him. My breath hitched, and I swear my heart skipped a beat at the sight of Danny. It always did. I couldn't help it. No more than he could help that he was part siren. He just had that effect on people. I couldn't imagine what a full-blooded siren looked like. Danny was inhumanly gorgeous, and he was barely 1/4 siren. His grin turned up slightly into a smirk. I knew that he was fully aware of his effect on people, and, considering his sense of humor, it amused him every time. No amount of logic could stop the reaction. Not the fact that I had a boyfriend, or the fact that I thought of Danny like an older brother, or the fact that I was very much not Danny's type.
He was lounging in the extra chair like a freaking centerfold, one arm draped over the back and his legs up on the edge of Charlie's desk. His feet were bare, and I honestly couldn't say if I had ever seen him wear shoes to work. I also doubted anyone gave him crap for it. When you were a special agent with a list of successful missions as long as Danny's, shoes at work were probably optional.
"I have stuff for you,"
I said. Fortunately, the more time I spent with Danny, the easier it was to recover from the siren effect. "Great, thanks," said Charlie, leaning forward to take it from me.
"Are you doing an early shift?"
I asked Danny. He usually didn't start work until I was about to leave. Of course, his voice was going to affect me nearly as much as his looks did. As a water elemental, he was capable of mimicking an insane amount of sounds and voices, but he usually had a melodious tenor, which he claimed was his real voice, that almost sounded like he was singing rather than talking. Then again, considering the water elemental language was essentially singing, it was entirely possible that he considered them one and the same.
I got called in early to transcribe some meeting that...
He shifted his weight and slid his cell phone out of his pocket.
That is now running 20 minutes behind. Guess I had time to go get coffee after all.
Or you could be in your office tidying up, Charlie suggested with a chuckle. Danny and I both laughed. In contrast with Charlie's somewhat organized office, Danny's was a chaotic mess of teetering towers of paper. I was pretty sure I spotted a pile of floppy disks once. They really were opposites, from work habits to, well, everything. As red as Charlie's hair was, Danny's was midnight blue. He kept it trimmed short enough that it didn't get in the way, but long enough that if he ran his fingers through it, it got messed up before falling neatly back into place. I wasn't entirely sure that wasn't a siren trait. Unlike the red flames that flared in Charlie's eyes, Danny's ebbed and flowed like water with countless shades of blue, a dead giveaway that he was a water elemental. Their eyes still fascinated me just as much as they had when we first met. I could remember a time when I couldn't tell their moods at a glance, but now I nearly always knew exactly how they were feeling, which was a necessity when you were dealing with any elemental. Eyes and hair aside, even though elementals looked nearly identical to humans, they weren't human. It was sometimes hard to remember, considering how human they seemed most of the time, but forgetting could be fatal. When they were hurt or angry, elementals could lose control to the point where they blacked out and had no memory of what was going on, often with disastrous consequences for anyone unlucky enough to be nearby. Elementals could, and did, kill people when they lost control. Not even close friends were safe. It was common enough that different types of elementals had specific terms for when they lost control, and now that I worked at Mez, I knew that there were procedures in place to interview and then basically pardon an elemental who could prove that a death had occurred because they were out of control at the time. I had seen both Danny and Charlie lose control in the past, and it was terrifying. You'd think that a fire elemental would be the scariest. Watching your friend burst into an inferno and kill a bunch of people, never mind they had been trying to kill us first, was pretty terrifying. But Charlie could only create fire within close proximity to him or control pre-existing fires that were farther away.
Most people would still consider an erupting fire elemental to be more dangerous than a typhooning water elemental, since they didn't typically do much damage outside of the water. Danny, however, was another story, and the idea of him losing control was scarier to me than Charlie blacking out. In addition to decades as a special agent with Mez, Danny had served in the Legion, the magic branch of the military, and was usually armed with a couple of knives, if not his gun. Not that having access to weapons mattered. He was also proficient in multiple forms of martial arts, and I was pretty sure he could kill me 100 ways with one hand, if he were so inclined. Although watching Danny sprawled over a chair, enduring some teasing about the state of his office, made it hard to remember what he was capable of. "One of these days," Charlie said, "you're gonna find a body instead of missing paperwork." "The offer for you to come burn it all is always open." Danny's chuckle turned into a groan as his phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen, then stood and stretched. "Time to listen in on a meeting." Charlie stood too, further highlighting their differences. Charlie was almost as short as me and somewhat stocky. Danny was easily a foot taller and lean and lithe. "My shift will probably be over before you're done," Charlie said. "Come say goodbye and rescue me." Charlie rolled his eyes fondly and hugged Danny. "I'll see you tonight, Dan." "See you then, C. Later, Jen." Danny waved and headed off to his office. "I should probably get back to work," I said. "Meet you in the garage?" asked Charlie. "Perfect." Once back at my desk, I finished up a fairly calm afternoon. When my workday was over, I had just enough time to chat with Thomas and T.S., arriving for their own shifts, in the parking garage before Charlie and Ember came to pick me up. Not long after they dropped me off at home, I got a "stand by" text from Mez, and my stomach dropped. I doubted I'd be called in, but the alert meant that Thomas and T.S. and Danny were probably going to have a long, potentially dangerous night. Chapter 3. Thomas. After a brief visit with Jen in the parking garage, something I was still happily adjusting to, I settled into my desk and started prioritizing emails. Someone opened my door without knocking, and the brine-tinged scent of water elemental hit my nose. "Hey, Danny-O," I said, without taking my eyes off the screen. I did, however, glance at the clock on my taskbar. "You're actually here on time." Danny chuckled and slung himself into the chair on the other side of my desk. I've been here for hours." He said it, deliberately, of course, in a way that made it impossible to tell if he really had been here for hours or if he just rolled in. Knowing full well I was waiting for clarification, he let me stew for a moment before offering, "Had to dust off my transcription skills for a meeting that took forever. And I didn't understand a word, so it was boring as hell." Ah, so he had actually been here. The water elemental ability to hear even the most subtle nuance in speech, combined with an incredibly complex writing system, made them skilled transcriptionists. They could even write down languages they didn't speak and read them back as correctly as a native speaker. Even though technology had come a long way since Danny started off as a transcriptionist for Mez, he was still faster and more accurate than any software. I nodded. "Let's hope for an easy night, then." "Please." He reached out and grabbed a to-go cup from our favorite coffee place off my desk.
That's not coffee.
Danio arched an eyebrow at me and took a curious sniff.
Smells like it. Are you lying to me so I don't steal any? You're welcome to find out.
Glaring at me suspiciously, he lifted the lid and stuck the tip of his finger in. His frown deepened as he swirled it around, testing the waters. Literally. I just waited.
This is coffee, he said. You did lie to...
He froze, then slowly pulled out his finger, recapped my cup, and set it back on my desk. I tried to suppress a smirk as he cleared his throat and wiped his finger on his pants. He took a deep breath, then cried,
You were going to let me drink that.
I shrugged.
I told you it wasn't coffee.
Yeah, well, I didn't think you were enhancing your cup of joe with a shot of Joe.
Technically, that one is a Joanne,
I chuckled. Danio groaned.
Lovely. That doesn't make it better.
I chuckled and took a sip of my enhanced coffee. There was a time I would have felt embarrassed drinking anything with blood in it in front of anyone. Then again, there was also a time when I would have flat out refused to drink any sort of blood if I could taste it. Funny how things change. He leaned back and propped his feet up on the corner of my desk.
So,
he said, gesturing toward my drink.
This is new.
Okay, so maybe I felt a little embarrassed now.
Yeah,
I said with a shrug. As it happened, it was very new. The first time, in fact, and a somewhat spontaneous choice. I was in line to get coffee behind another vampire who ordered his with a couple pumps of blood. I wasn't unfamiliar with the concept, but I never considered it before. While I waited to order, I asked him if it was any good, and he said he wouldn't drink coffee any other way anymore. So I figured, why not? I had to admit the added rush from the blood, coupled with my favorite latte, was delicious.
How is it?
Danio asked. I cleared my throat and admitted.
It's actually pretty good. Want some?
I added with a grin. He snorted.
I'll pass.
It occurred to me that even though I was becoming comfortable feeding in front of him, he might not feel the same way.
You don't mind, do you?
I asked.
I mean, if you're uncomfortable at all, with the drinking blood.
Danio shook his head.
The only thing I'm uncomfortable with is that now I can't steal your coffee, and I have to drink the nasty stuff in the break room.
How terrible for you. I took another sip and absent-mindedly started scrolling through emails.
Good for you,
Danio said. I glanced up at him curiously.
What?
Good for you, he repeated, nodding toward my coffee.
You've come a long way.
Even after I stopped hating myself for being a vampire, I couldn't bring myself to embrace it. Sure, I grudgingly accepted it for a few decades, but it wasn't until the last couple of years, thanks to a new outlook on life and some amazing support and encouragement from Jen, that I really started allowing myself to enjoy some of the perks. It felt sort of weird after decades of denying it, but I felt like I was finally starting to feel comfortable in my own skin again. Strange as it was to think, I was actually really enjoying being a vampire. I flashed Danio a grateful smile.
Yeah, I guess I have.
He hadn't known me at my worst, but I had still been pretty messed up when we met. He was wrestling with his own demons at the time, and the two of us hit it off right away. Quite honestly, I wasn't sure that either one of us would have gotten to where we were now without the help of the other, and knowing that he approved of my new unconventional coffee made me happy.
"And how are you?"
I asked, shooting him a look that made it clear I was probing a little deeper than just typical small talk. He shrugged. "I'm doing pretty good." His eyes churned in annoyance. "Do you have any idea how many aquatic wedding venues there are around here?"
"Do you have any idea you're marrying a fire elemental?"
I retorted. He rolled his eyes. "Tell that to my mother, please." I laughed.
"I thought she was usually obnoxiously over-accommodating of Charlie's needs."
"Usually," he snorted in annoyance. "But apparently she thinks our wedding requires an obscene amount of water. And while I typically enjoy obscene amounts of water, I prefer them, not all over my boyfriend."
"You mean your fiancé?"
I corrected. "Yeah, I'm still getting used to that."
"You've been engaged for 5 years."
"And we were dating for 25. Give me a break." I chuckled and took another sip of my coffee before returning to my emails. Danny pulled out his phone and fiddled with it as I worked. A few calm minutes, interspersed with small talk, had passed when I felt a rush of sudden emotions from Tethys. I trailed off in the middle of my sentence to focus on him. Under most circumstances, I would have tried to block him out and kept talking. Luckily, Danio was one of the few people I trusted enough with the truth about our bond. He watched me for a moment, eyes graying slightly with concern. "TS all right?"
"Yeah."
The emotions were consistent with a call to investigate something. It was the usual mix of werewolf excitement, concern for whoever was involved, curiosity, and caution. And yet, there was an undertone of something.
"Field agents just got called out."
I narrowed my eyes. Yes, I was sensing something else.
"He's worried, though. More so than usual."
Danio hummed in concern. "Now I really wish your coffee wasn't sanguinated. Think I have time to grab some?"
"Probably. They're only just leaving. It'll be a while until they assess it."
He stood and stretched. "I'll be right back." Instead of returning to my emails, I sat back and focused on Tethys, following along as he left the building. He was in a hurry. That wasn't good either. My phone vibrated, and even though I knew what it was, I pulled it out to check. "Stand by." I marked the text as read without opening it and tucked my phone back in my pocket. With nothing better to do, I checked the daily schedule to see who was on duty with Tethys tonight. Morgan Fletcher. We had worked with him for a couple of decades now. Poor guy lost his familiar a while back and had been a lot less social ever since. Nevertheless, he was still a skilled wizard and experienced field agent. Satisfied that Tethys had a good partner to watch his back, I tried to distract myself by going back to reviewing my emails. Tethys and Fletcher were field agents. When something happened that needed Mez attention, a field agent team went first. You never knew what exactly the issue was, so everyone got a standby notification to be ready whenever the field agents went out. It was their job to assess the situation and either deal with it or get in touch with someone who could. Sometimes that meant bringing in memory potions and a cover-up team for a secrecy breach, or a team of special agents to handle something more dangerous. True to his word, it wasn't long before I smelled water elemental and fresh coffee. However, the sound of Danio's footsteps went by my office and on to his. He was hardly there a minute before he left again, probably grabbing a couple of knives or extra bullets. "Anything?" he asked, settling back down across from me. I focused on my connection with Tethys and shook my head. "Still on the road." Danio and I were the primary special agents on duty tonight, so if the call for backup came, it would be us going out. He sipped his coffee quietly while I looked over, without really reading, my emails again. I realized I had just read the same one a few times in a row and minimized it. Waiting was the worst part of this job. The minutes ticked by, and I felt a change from Tethys. "They're there," I said. I closed my eyes, trying to zero in on where Tethys was and how far away. "That way somewhere," I pointed. Danio hummed and checked the working compass tattooed on his palm. "Almost due south." His eyes narrowed, and a ripple of gray passed through them. "How long did that take?" I checked the time. "Around an hour." "Isn't that about how far the park is?" I groaned. "God, I hope not." A few tense minutes went by, and I suddenly felt a jab of pain, like I had accidentally bitten my tongue. Except I hadn't bitten my tongue, and it wasn't an accident. It was Tethys getting my attention. "Let's go," I said, standing. "They're going to call for backup." "Shit." "Yeah," I agreed. The standard procedure was for the field agents to call the dispatcher and brief them on the situation. Then the dispatcher would call us. Tethys alerting me early meant that he considered every second critical and wanted us there as soon as possible. It was also something he rarely did. Our bond was, well, abnormal, and anything that might make people suspicious was always risky. Danio and I headed straight to my car and hit the road. Even though following a bond in anything but a direct line was tricky, I knew Tethys was south and outside the city, so I went straight for the highway. We were just exiting when my cell phone rang. Danio grabbed it from the cup holder and checked it. "Dispatch," he said before switching his voice to a perfect impression of me. "Agent Clark. Yeah, what's going on?" He listened for a moment. "Got it. We're on the way. Yeah, Pelagos is with me." I snorted at his reference to himself in third person as he hung up. My amusement died instantly as he let loose a stream of curses in multiple languages. "That bad?" I asked. "We're going to the park," he answered grimly. I groaned. Allegheny State Park, the one place I was hoping we wouldn't go. "Is there a break in the missing wizard case?" I asked hopefully. "No, there's another missing person, wood elemental." Well, there went any hope it wasn't foul play. Wood elementals didn't tend to get lost in the woods. I heaved a sigh and pressed my foot down on the gas pedal. Another missing magic, hardly 2 weeks after the last case. If this was anything like the others, there wouldn't be any evidence. Sometimes there was nothing but the word of a friend that a magic had gone to the park and hadn't come back. Other times, it was a campsite that looked like someone had simply walked away from it, or an abandoned boat or backpack. Not a single case had been solved yet. We didn't know how many there had been. All we knew was that all of a sudden, just a few years ago, Agents started realizing we were going to the park a lot, and always for the same thing. "What the hell is doing this, Tom?" Danio asked, breaking into my thoughts. "How are these people just vanishing without a trace?" "Wish I knew." I hit the gas a little harder. "Is T.S. okay?" I nodded. "Feels like he's just waiting for us. He's excited about something, though." "Evidence, you think?" "I hope." Danio sighed. "Yeah." We rode the rest of the way in somber silence. Even Danio, who normally joked his way through stressful situations, kept quiet. It took just under an hour to get there, but it seemed like forever. Dispatch gave us directions to a parking lot, and I pulled in and parked next to Tethys's truck. He was there waiting, along with Morgan Fletcher. They both looked grim as we approached. "Wood elemental?" I said, not bothering with a greeting. I wanted to ask why Tethys was excited, but knew he'd tell me soon and couldn't ask with Morgan there anyway. Tethys nodded. "Right, but this one only went missing a few hours ago. There's still a fresh scent." Morgan flipped open a notepad. "He was supposed to meet a friend here to go camping this evening. Seems that they've actually been paying attention to the mez alerts about strange things happening in the area. As soon as our missing elemental didn't meet up with him, he called us, just in case." He pointed across the parking lot to another car. "That's the missing elemental's car. We know he was here, but now he's roughly 3 hours late." "Where's the witness?" Danio asked. "Heading back home with instructions to call us immediately if he hears from his friend," Tethys said. "Is there any rain on the way, Danny?" Danny tilted his head up at the sky and frowned. A few streaks of dark blue rippled through his eyes. "No," he said confidently. "Let's get on that scent then," I said. They nodded and led the way to the woods. "I wanted to follow it right away," Tethys said as we walked. "Standard procedure is to wait," Morgan reminded him. "You said you'd still be able to follow the scent, and we don't know what's out there. I don't know about you, but I'd rather not be the next victim." Soon we arrived in an empty clearing. There were a few scattered scents, including Morgan and Tethys. "This was supposed to be the meeting place," Morgan said. "T.S.?" Tethys pointed deeper into the woods. "The wood elemental scent goes off this way. He was here and then—" He shrugged. "Who knows? He was here and then walked away." "And never came back," Morgan finished darkly. Tethys handed me a sweatshirt. "Here's the scent for ya. We got this out of the car. Friend confirmed it belongs to our wood elemental." I closed my eyes and inhaled deeply, making sure I had a good feel for it. The scent would be annoying to follow in the woods with all the trees. I felt a strange shiver pass through me and knew without looking that Tethys had shifted. The four of us followed the scent at a fast pace. "Smells fresher here," Tethys commented. I nodded in agreement. We were getting closer. And then another scent hit me. I paused and sniffed again. "T.S., do you smell a witch?" I asked. He trotted over to me, nose to the ground. "I do, and I don't think it's much older than the wood elemental." He continued on a bit. "It goes this way." "We can circle back to it," Morgan said. "I don't want to lose track of our missing person." "Unless this witch went missing too," Danny said. "Or did it?" Tethys shook himself and sat down, considering it.
or witnessed it, whichever one. We shouldn't let this trail go cold either.
We'll take it, I offered. Morgan frowned.
I don't like us splitting up.
Thomas is my sole packmate, Tethys reminded him. If they get into trouble, I'll know.
And what if we get into trouble?
Morgan pressed. He may have been a fellow agent, but that relationship only extended so far. We weren't nearly close enough to entrust him with the knowledge that I could sense Tethys just as easily. As far as Morgan, not to mention just about everyone else in the world, was aware, the rare soul pack bond that werewolves could form was a one-way deal.
I have a whistle,
Tethys said, turning his head back to indicate a small pack of supplies strapped to him.
I suppose that'll do, Morgan said grudgingly, fishing out the whistle.
There was no way we'd get so far apart that I wouldn't be able to hear the whistle, and even if I couldn't, the sound it made was up in a high octave that a water elemental could hear from a great distance as well. Danio and I headed after the witch's scent. I wasn't sure where I was expecting it to lead. Hopefully to a camp or somewhere we could find her and question her. To my relief, the scent started getting just a little stronger, which meant we were going in the same direction she had. It occurred to me that I couldn't smell her familiar. She must have had a raven. The thought made me pause and look around. If the witch was in some way responsible for the disappearances, we didn't need her raven flying on ahead and warning her we were coming.
Thomas?
Danio asked softly.
Keep your eyes open. There could be a raven around.
He nodded, then scanned the trees warily. We kept walking, and suddenly I felt a burst of emotion from Tethys, followed by pain. It hit me hard enough to knock the wind out of me, and I fell to my knees with a gasp.
Tom!
Danio cried in alarm. He was at my side in an instant.
Tethys!
I gasped, staggering to my feet. Danio held me steady as I tried to catch my breath. I turned in the direction I could sense Tethys in. There was a fuzzy emptiness that could only mean one thing.
He's unconscious.
Scatta, Danio spat. Go. I took off at full vampire speed, hurtling through the woods. It would be impossible for him to keep up, but Danio was fast enough in his own right. He was also a decent tracker. I trusted him to catch up. To my relief, Tethys woke up before I got there. Soon, the woods were echoing with the piercing sound of the emergency whistle. I could sense that whatever had hit him was gone. He was certainly freaked out, but didn't feel like he thought he was in immediate danger. I slowed down, both to give Danny a chance to catch up and to not hit the scene too quickly. Nevertheless, I was on them in a flash.
Whoa,
I gasped.
Careful, Thomas,
Tethys warned. I slowed and came to a hesitant stop near them. Morgan and Tethys were sitting in a large blackened circle of grass and leaves. A strange, foul smell, like the blood of a dead animal, filled the air. I had never seen or smelled anything like it.
What happened?
I cried.
Are you okay?
I think so, said Tethys.
I don't really know what hit us.
He wasn't entirely okay either. I could tell he was still in pain. His entire body was throbbing. I blocked out the pain and went closer as he and Morgan slowly rose to their feet.
1 minute we were following the scent, the next...
Morgan's voice was strained. He shook his head.
There was a sound,
Tethys said.
Like some sort of clicking? Crackling,
Morgan said.
It reminded me of electricity. Then,
cautiously, I edged closer until I reached them. Tethys stumbled out of the circle and leaned heavily against me. I patted his side gently to comfort him.
Was it wards?
I asked, looking at the circle. Admittedly, warding was something I only just started to study before I was turned, but I knew they usually formed a circle around something.
I've never heard of wards that can do that,
Morgan said.
There's something on your face,
I said. He turned his head to the side and gasped.
What?
Your veins are... I began. He reached up a hand to feel his cheek, and I saw it was on his arm, too. Morgan noticed and looked at it in alarm.
What is this?
He cried. His veins were incredibly prominent, practically bulging, and they were so dark they looked black. Both forearms, his face, and neck were covered in dark webs of veins rising abnormally high out of his skin. Even the smaller blood vessels were darker than normal, spreading out all over him like a strange tattoo. I swear I could actually see his carotid artery pulsating. And yet, his blood pressure and heartbeat seemed perfectly normal. A bit high and fast, maybe, but that was to be expected after being attacked.
Are you like that too, Teth?
I asked. For an answer, he shifted back into a human. Sure enough, he too was covered in a dark network of swollen veins. He raised a hand, frowning at the black lines running along it. It almost looked as if his veins were on top of his skin, they were so huge.
We must be close,
he said grimly.
I don't think anyone has encountered this before. Which way were you heading?
Tethys pointed.
I'm in no shape to keep going,
Morgan said.
I don't think any of us should, not until we know more about whatever this is. I can't either,
Tethys confessed. I didn't blame him. I could sense how much pain he was still in, and knew Morgan probably was too.
Danio and I will keep on the scent and see how far we get. We can't lose it now, I said.
Tethys nodded.
I've got healing potions in my truck. Morgan and I will head back and meet you in the parking lot. I don't fancy sitting here.
Sounds good.
Hey, where is Danio?
Morgan asked.
Behind me a bit. I came as fast as I could when I heard the whistle.
Alone? Said Morgan. Tethys and I exchanged a look of alarm. God, I had left him alone. Careless. Stupid. I turned and rushed back the way I had come, hearts pounding. I would never forgive myself if he disappeared because of me. Be careful, mate, I heard Tethys yell from behind me. I followed my own scent until I caught a whiff of water elemental. Danio, I screamed. Where was he? I spun in alarm, trying to track where he had gone. Danio! What? I stopped short, nearly crashing into him. I heaved a sigh of relief as he studied me skeptically. Don't, I said breathlessly, clapping him on the shoulder.
Don't do that to me again.
Okay.
I left you alone.
I'm a big boy, he snorted. I don't know how he managed to sound indignant and flirtatious, but he found a way. His expression quickly turned serious. What happened to T.S. and Morgan? Are they okay?
I'll fill you in, but we're following the wood elemental's scent now. Come on.
I turned and retraced my steps, with Danio hot on my heels. I'd like to remind you that you left them alone too. Are they okay? He pressed.
None of the missing persons were with anyone when they went missing, I said. They were all by themselves.
So far, nagged a voice in the back of my head.
They're heading back to the parking lot anyway.
There, the wood elemental's trail.
This way.
As we walked, I told him how I found T.S. and Morgan and the strange thing that happened to them. Well, it's not wards, he said confidently. We used 1,000 different ones in the Legion, and none of them did anything like that. Soon, we were close to where the attack, if that's what it was, happened. We hadn't gone much further when I heard a strange sound.
Do you hear?
I began. A crackle. Move! I screamed, hurling myself to the side. The crackle became a roar, and something hit me from every direction at once, and somehow from inside as well. I think I screamed. The next thing I knew, I was sprawled on the blackened and destroyed ground, pain radiating through my body. I slowly forced myself to sit up, head pounding and spinning. The first thing I noticed was that the veins in my arms were all dark and swollen, just like Morgan and Tethys. In fact, it almost seemed like the pain was coming from them. Then, the awful scent of dead blood hit my nose, and I gagged. Chapter 4. Thomas. Logic forced its way through the pain, and I remembered I wasn't alone.
Danio?
I called. I looked around frantically and spotted him a few feet away. I tried, and failed, to stand. Instead, I somehow half-crawled, half-dragged myself to him. He was covered in a network of dark, bulging veins as well.
Danio?
Yeah, he groaned. He was curled in on himself, arms wrapped around his abdomen, face creased in pain. Oh, shit. His stomach.
Is your...
I stopped. While Danio had suffered with chronic pain from a poorly healed injury for decades, it had finally healed a few years ago. This wasn't right. And yet, from the way he was clutching it... My hands balled into fists, and I let out a soft hiss. If whatever this was had somehow re-aggravated his stomach injury, I was going to slaughter them. I swallowed hard.
Is your stomach okay?
No. Before I could panic, he changed his answer. Yes.
What?
He rolled onto his back with a groan and uncurled, then pinched the bridge of his nose. I think it's just in my head. Give me a minute.
What do you mean it?
I trailed off as his words actually sank in and took a better look at him. I could have kicked myself. It shouldn't have taken me so long to recognize a shell shock-induced flashback when I saw one. Then again, as far as I knew, Danio hadn't had a bad one like this in years. I cautiously reached for his shoulder. He flinched a little, but I kept my hand there.
It's okay. It's just me. Can you sit?
Danio didn't answer, but did let me help him up. We sat there for a minute as I gently rubbed his back and kept a wary eye on the woods around us. While I waited for him to recover, I tried to calm myself down. Tethys had sensed the attack, and my panic thinking Danio was hurt hadn't helped. Stomach injury or not, whoever did this was not going to have a good day when I found them. At last, Danio heaved a sigh. I'm okay. Sorry. Don't be. You sure you're okay? I've been better, although I've also been dead, so probably my scale is a little off. He shuddered. That was just a little more landmine-like than I was prepared for. Sorry. Quit apologizing, I said firmly. Yeah. Danio looked at me, and his eyes widened. Oh, you weren't kidding about the vein thing. He raised an arm and examined his own protruding veins. This is gross. And drought. It's really painful. Is it affecting our circulation at all? Can you sense anything weird? Danio narrowed his eyes and concentrated. No, he said after a moment. Nothing out of the ordinary. I mean, my blood pressure is a little high, but I just had a moment, so that's not a surprise. Anything around us? He looked around, eyes rippling with dark blues as he used his water elemental senses. No, although... He lifted his hand off the ground and frowned at his palm. There's some moisture on the ground that tastes pretty nasty. You getting anything? I shook my head. It smells awful, but I've never seen anything like this. Me neither. Hurts like hell, though. I could sense that Tethys was starting to feel better. Either the potions had kicked in, or whatever happened was wearing off. I rubbed at one arm, feeling my veins beneath my hand as I did. Yeah, it feels like my blood stings. He hummed agreeably, and we both sat silently, examining our strange wounds. Do you think it's blood magic? Danio asked suddenly. I snorted. Of course. What else could it possibly... My sarcastic retort died as we made eye contact. You're not joking. We went over it briefly in some agent class with Mez, didn't we? Did we? I frowned. I had no recollection of that. I thought so. What did they say? Danio hummed in thought. Blood magic. If you encounter blood magic, I think it's stand down, do not engage, and call for a medic, maybe? I crossed my arms and arched an eyebrow at him. A Mez class? I asked skeptically. Yeah, no. Legion. No wonder you didn't remember. Tethys was starting to get antsy. We should head back. Can you stand? I think so. We slowly climbed to our feet and limped back toward the parking lot. Tethys relaxed as soon as he sensed our progress. Did you ever see blood magic in the Legion? I asked as we walked. Not that I know of. We only ran into enemy magics a few times. It was always just a lot of staring each other down, although they did have some weird potions and shit in Saigon, so I suppose it's possible there was blood magic around. Do you remember anything useful about it? Not really. Danio answered with a shrug. It has probably changed a lot since I was there anyway. Hell, it's not even Saigon anymore, is it? About blood magic. Oh, no. Don't engage and call a medic was the extent of my knowledge. You are super helpful, I told him. Well, do you know anything about blood magic? Just one thing. Nothing useful. Danio obviously heard something in my tone, but before he could pry, Tethys limped up to us.
"We're okay,"
I assured him as he drew close.
"Here,"
he said, offering a couple of vials of potions.
"These seem to be helping. They're just healing accelerants, not painkillers,"
he added, as we both noticed Danio eyeing them skeptically. We both took one and followed Tethys the rest of the way to the parking lot.
"You two okay?"
Morgan called.
"Could be better,"
I said.
"How are you?"
"Getting there, I think." Tethys leaned heavily against the side of his truck.
"What the hell was that?"
Danio and I exchanged a glance.
"We think it may have been blood magic,"
I said.
"Blood magic?"
Tethys snorted.
That's forbidden."
"Forbidden?" asked Morgan.
"It's just a myth, isn't it?"
"Either way, we should get back and report. Whatever happened to us hasn't happened to any agents before," Tethys said. "We've got to finally be on the right track." We elected to share a car back, just in case our conditions took a turn for the worse. I volunteered to drive, and nobody argued. If something did happen, it would likely hit Morgan or Tethys before me, giving me time to pull over. And I didn't want Danio to drive if his thoughts were still elsewhere. It was a long but uneventful trip. There was a doctor waiting at Mez for us, one who had no idea what hit us. After an exam, we were sent on our way. Morgan's car was still in the garage, and he assured us he'd be fine, so we piled back into mine. Danio called an old friend from the Legion, who was a doctor, in case he knew anything. He had never personally encountered blood magic, but said it did sound like it. According to him, as long as we weren't dead yet, we'd be fine.
"Staying at our place?"
I offered as I drove. We lived closer to Mez than Danny did, and it was usually where we all crashed after a late night.
"Sure, thanks."
Danio chuckled darkly.
"Char will freak out when he sees me anyway. Maybe this will be gone by morning."
As soon as we got home, he said goodnight and went around the back to our little pond. He'd heal faster in the water and would likely sleep there all night. Jen, of course, had waited up on the couch. As much as I would have liked to greet her, I was somewhat relieved she was asleep. I didn't have the energy to explain what happened. Instead, I carefully carried her upstairs, tucked her into our bed, and then gratefully collapsed next to her. I slept until mid-afternoon and still felt sore when I woke up. While my veins had all receded, they were still incredibly dark. I hoped Jen wouldn't notice, but I knew her better than that. "Good morning," she teased as I entered the living room. "Was everything okay last—" "Oh my God, what is that?"
"It's a long story."
She set down her book and straightened, obviously ready for me to tell it immediately. I chuckled and sat down next to her. By the time I was done, she was staring at me in horror. Tethys joined us halfway through, still covered in dark veins like me. "And nobody has any idea what it was?" she demanded. We shook our heads. The tension was broken by Tethys's stomach audibly rumbling. Even Jen heard it and laughed.
"Think I'll get some breakfast,"
Tethys chuckled.
"Is Danio up yet?"
he asked as we followed him across the living room.
"No,"
I said in concern.
"I should probably check on him. Or maybe just make him another pot of coffee."
It was my voice, but I hadn't spoken. We entered the kitchen to find Daniel sitting at the counter with a mug of coffee. He looked exhausted.
"I can do that,"
I said.
"You all right?"
"Just tired."
"Why didn't you take a sleeping potion?"
I was pretty sure he had either been kept awake by nightmares or had just stayed up on purpose to avoid them.
"That would have involved getting out of the water, and I was too sore for that,"
he said with a shrug.
"You should take one and go back out."
Danio got up and helped himself to another cup of coffee.
"I'll be fine." "Will you?"
I asked, fixing him with a look that made it clear I wasn't asking about our weird injuries. His answering smile was small but genuine.
"Yes, I was kind of rattled, but I'm okay."
"If you say—" I trailed off. I could hear a familiar car pulling up the driveway.
"Tom?"
Tethys asked.
"John's here."
Curious, I left the kitchen and headed for the front door to meet him. John and his wife took me in after my parents died, and while we were all very close, dropping by unannounced wasn't like him. Before opening the door, I pulled his slippers out of the closet and set them out for him. Then I went out onto the front porch to wait. As he strode up the driveway, a dark shape plummeted from the sky. At the last moment, Fend snapped open his wings and soared along the ground, landing on the porch railing.
"Hey, Fend,"
I said.
"Hello, Thomas."
At the moment, he was some sort of bird of prey, although it was hard to tell which with all his black plumage. He bobbed to me, then ruffled his feathers and shrank down into a raven.
"Thomas,"
John echoed, joining us on the porch. He was holding an old-looking book under one arm. He raised his other, and his familiar flapped over and landed on his shoulder. John turned his attention to me, and his eyes widened in alarm as he took in the network of veins marring my skin. With a heavy sigh, he asked,
"How are you?"
"It looks worse than it feels," I offered.
"Please, come in, John Toussaint."
He bowed his head slightly to me and joined me in the foyer. Wordlessly, he exchanged his shoes for slippers and walked into my living room. Fend flew across the room and landed on the back of a chair. The others had come into the living room to wait.
"Jennifer, Rack, Tethys,"
John said in greeting.
"Ah, I'm glad you're already here, Danio. I wanted to speak with you as well."
With that, he sat on a couch and gestured for us to join him. He set the book on his lap and drummed his fingers on it for a moment before studying us quietly. At last, he sighed.
"Oh, my boys. I had hoped the report was wrong. Blood magic."
"It is blood magic, then?" Tethys said.
"I'm afraid so."
We all exchanged a look of alarm, and Jen sighed. "I thought I was done being the only one who doesn't know anything about magic," she groaned. "But what exactly is blood magic?"
"Don't worry, Jen,"
Danio said.
"I have no idea."
"It's forbidden," Tethys offered.
"That's pretty much all I know."
"It's how they made vampires," I blurted. Everyone but John looked at me in shock. I always hoped it was just a stupid rumor, but John's lack of surprise said everything. So, it was true. John nodded solemnly.
"Few people know more than that," he said. "Fewer still have seen it, and with good reason."
He paused, brow creased in thought. At last, he spoke.
Blood magic has been practiced by witches and wizards all over the world for as far back as our history goes. Back to the very first witches and wizards, according to some. Take fire magic, for example. It can do many things. With only a wand and the word mar, one can create fire. But mar can also make heat or light. It can give night vision or take away sight altogether. And fire magic can cleanse or purify. We all nodded along when he paused. Like fire magic, blood magic has many uses and forms, but one needs more than a wand and magic word to wield it. Blood magic can only be used by those who have performed ritual sacrifice. I feel like you don't mean goats, Danio said. People, said John grimly. Blood wizards practice human sacrifice. My mouth went dry. I knew blood magic involved some sort of blood, obviously, but I hadn't put much thought into it, especially when it was little more than hearsay and rumors, and just when I was getting comfortable being a vampire. John pursed his lips for a moment. Throughout history, those who use blood magic have been feared and ostracized. Some have been executed. Others have been revered, if not outright worshipped. Some cultures tried to outlaw it. Some turned a blind eye, and others embraced it. But then came the war. He paused and turned to Jen. Are you familiar with the war, Jennifer? She nodded, and her eyes flicked briefly to me. Yeah, the one that lasted hundreds of years and impacted pretty much every magic across Europe? The one... She trailed off and glanced at me again. John nodded once. Hi, that one. After raging for centuries, one side decided they needed something more if they were to win. Many history books will tell you they were the only ones to use blood magic. He chuckled darkly. European history books. Growing up in Japan, we were taught both sides practiced it. Regardless, one side used blood magic in a way no one had before. They used it to create entirely new, powerful species of magics they could unleash upon their enemies. Once again, we all nodded. Jen reached out and took my hand to give it a reassuring squeeze. John took a deep breath. Many of their creations failed, but some succeeded and thrived. Banshees, berserkers, vampires, I whispered. He inclined his head in a single nod. Vampires? When the war was over, most magics agreed that blood magic could not be allowed to continue. A campaign began to eradicate it. Those who practiced had their memories erased, or worse. All records of it were destroyed, out of fear someone would study them and learn, even if there were no bloodcasters left to teach them. After that, there were very few places where it was an accepted form of magic. Today, the few scattered bloodcasters practice in secret. Is that why the first vampires were said to be the witches and wizards who tried to make them? I asked. They used blood magic on themselves? John nodded. That's what I've heard. Blood magic has been used for many things over the millennia. Entire civilizations, magic and non, have fallen. It has been called curses, sorcery, black magic, hexes. There have been blood wizards all over the world, sometimes helping non-magics rise to power, some taking it for themselves.
Yamahime no Chi in Japan, the Dark Sorcerer King in Gaul, the Great Wizard Duinos, La Reine de... He paused and looked curiously at Tethys, who had chuckled. "Sorry," said Tethys. "When I was a pup, my great-granddad would tell my litter and I that Duinos would get us if we didn't get to bed on time. Never knew he was a blood wizard." "According to the legend," John said. "And that's what most of these are, legends. I'm afraid there is little more I know about blood magic." "But you're confident that's what hit us?" I asked. "I said," began John slowly, "that some places continued to practice blood magic. Japan was among them." "Japan?" I cried in surprise. "Not during your lifetime." Danio regarded him curiously. "During yours?" John bowed his head. "Hi. It was not widely practiced. I never personally saw any, and it had nearly died out when I was young. The only ones authorized to use blood magic had served the Omaho imperial family, but even after it was finally declared forbidden, unlike much of the world, depictions and records of blood magic were not destroyed." With that, he took the old book off his lap and set it on the coffee table. He opened it to a page with a picture that looked like a traditional Japanese painting. We all leaned over to study it. There were 3 people in it. 2 were dressed like samurai and holding short swords. No, they were wrong for wakizashi and far too small for katana. I looked closer and realized they were supposed to be wands. The 3rd man was tied to something, and I swallowed hard. He was covered in a network of eerily familiar black lines. The picture was captioned, and I squinted at it, trying to decipher it. While living in Japan, I learned hundreds of kanji, but now I had forgotten more than I remembered. I could get by reading the much simpler hiragana characters, but there were only a couple in the caption. Even if I did know the kanji, they were all heavily stylized and faded. "What does it say?" Tethys asked, saving me from having to say it. John read it in Japanese, then translated it into English. I assumed the translation was mostly for Jen and Rack's benefit, since they had only been studying Japanese for a few years, but some of the words were archaic and unfamiliar to me. "This depicts 2 blood wizards punishing a man for speaking ill of the Omahu Emperor. The markings on his skin will bring him shame until they fade." John read. "Well, at least they fade, eventually," Danio said, examining his hand. "Do we know how long that takes?" I asked. John shook his head. "I'm afraid not." "So, if this really is blood magic, then what is it doing in the park?" Tethys asked. "And does it have anything to do with these disappearances?" "That is what we must figure out," said John. Danio cleared his throat. What if all of the missing people are being sacrificed?" John blew out a long breath. "That is a very disturbing possibility indeed." He stood slowly. Fend soared across the room to land on his shoulder, then nibbled his ear. I swallowed hard. Fend only did that when John was upset. "I must go. I have much to do." He looked around at us for a moment. "Stay home for the next few days and rest. If any of you think you are getting worse instead of better, call me immediately." We all returned his low bow, and he headed out. I walked him to the door while he changed shoes and followed him out onto the porch. "Take care, Thomas," he said, hugging me briefly. "I will, Janto-san," I promised. Everyone was still solemnly sitting in the living room. I joined Jen on the couch, and she leaned against me silently. Rack brushed against my leg. The minutes ticked by, and nobody spoke. Then I heard the sound of another familiar car. It wasn't long before the door opened and Charlie hurtled in. "Are you all right?" he demanded. "The office is going crazy with all these rumors and... Oh my God, Danny-O!" He rushed across the room, grabbed Danny-O by the chin, and started examining his face. "What happened?" "Just ran into a little blood magic," Danny-O said. Danny-O was lucky fire elementals couldn't set people on fire simply by glaring. "That is not funny," Charlie said. I cleared my throat awkwardly. "He's not joking." Charlie's jaw dropped. "What?" he yelped. We quickly filled him in, and soon there were 5 of us sitting wordlessly on the couches. "Hey, Charlie, aren't you supposed to be at work?" Danny-O asked suddenly. "I left early to make sure you were okay." I texted and said I was. Charlie snorted. "Yeah, except the office is all fired up because there was another disappearance in the park last night, and all 4 agents who investigated aren't at work today, and different agents have been called in to cover their shifts for the next 3 days. He crossed his arms and glared, dark flames flaring in his eyes. "And they're saying y'all stopped by the doctor when you got back, and that something weird had happened to you." "I appreciate your concern," Danny-O said. "You're gonna be the death of me," Charlie said before hugging him. "Are we hanging out here, or do you want to get home?" "I should probably get home and soak for a while," Danny-O said. "Let me grab my wallet and stuff." He turned and headed down to the basement. "Hey, Char," I said as soon as he was out of sight. "Yeah?" I went over to him and whispered. He had a rough night. The attack reminded him of the explosion. Charlie cursed. "Make sure he gets some rest?" He nodded. "I'll take care of him. Thanks, Thomas." Danny-O returned. "Ready?" "Yeah." Charlie hugged him tightly. "You all right?" Danny-O caught my eye over Charlie's shoulder and arched a questioning eyebrow. I shrugged in answer. He pulled Charlie a little closer. "I'm fine, C. Don't worry." He nodded to me. "See you later, Tom. Bye, T.S. Bye, Jen." "Bye," they chorused. "Get some sleep," Tethys advised. He yawned as they left. "I think I might go back to bed, actually." "Not a bad idea." He headed back up the stairs, and I was left with Jen. I sat down heavily on the couch, and she joined me. "Did you get to feed last night?" she asked. "No." "You need some blood, then. Want me to order some from Aaron's?" I was surprised. "You're not going to offer to let me feed?" Jen fixed me with a smug smirk. "You need more than half a pint, and if you feed from me, you'll put off getting more." "I drink a full pint from you when I need it," I protested. She leveled a glare at me. "No, you do not." I couldn't argue. She was right. "I'd rather not feed from you while I'm riddled with blood magic anyway. I said instead. That's fair. She leaned over and pressed an ear against my chest. Your stomach heart sounds empty. You're due to feed tonight anyway, aren't you? I nodded. So, you rest. I'll order a couple of pints for you.
Thank you.
She sat up and kissed me. Of course. I want lunch anyway.
Can you also get something for T.S.? He feels hungry.
Absolutely. Jen jumped up and grabbed her phone from the coffee table. I'll go order.
The menu for errands is in the menu drawer. Should be on top.
I called as she headed into the kitchen. Thanks, she called, voice laced with sarcasm. I was going to Google for Aaron's Enchanted Eats and pull up the menu online, but the old-fashioned way sounds equally effective.
Yeah,
I laughed. Can't believe you guys redid the kitchen in this century and still have a menu drawer, I heard her mutter. I sat back and chuckled. Had she really only moved in a couple short months ago? Sometimes it seemed like she had been here with me for years, if not decades.
How'd I get so lucky?
I murmured.
I think Jen would say the same thing.
Rack purred from his basket on the hearth.
Thanks, Rack.
Maybe it was all the talk of vampire creation, but my thoughts drifted briefly to what it was like to have a familiar in the house, and what life would have been like had mine survived that night. She would have liked Jen, I thought. Of course, if she had lived, I wouldn't have been reeling from a freshly broken bond the moment Tethys formed a soul pack bond with me. At least, that was our theory for why our bond enabled me to sense him. A soul pack bond was similar to the bond formed between a wizard and a familiar, and just as powerful, except instead of being able to sense each other, only the werewolf could sense their soul pack mate. If the death of my familiar, at almost the exact instant Tethys bonded to me, had been the cause of our unique two-way bond, we couldn't let the word get out that it was possible. If that happened, we were afraid that someone else would try to recreate it and start killing familiars. Considering that the death of one half of a bonded pair typically resulted in the death of the other, it would be even more horrific. Jen started ordering, and I listened in, glad to be distracted from my thoughts. A minute later, she was back, with a mug of coffee for both of us. She rejoined me on the couch. 40 minutes, she said, handing me a mug.
Thanks, Jen. I do love you.
She laughed and kissed me on the cheek. I love you too. She waited a beat, then asked, How many decades have you had that menu in your drawer? True, Aaron's was around when I moved in, and I had been ordering from there for decades, but I was pretty sure I changed out the menu once in a while.
Not long?
It had a coupon on it that expired 8 years ago. We both laughed, then sat quietly for a bit. I could tell she was studying me and assumed she was looking at the veins until she asked, Are you okay? I gather some of that was news for you, too.
I'm all right. I was a little disturbed by some of it, but
I shrugged.
I'm a lot more concerned by the possibility there are bloodcasters kidnapping and sacrificing people nearby, and to go unnoticed for years. The thought made me shiver. How long has this been going on? Jen asked. I feel like you were dealing with missing magics back when I was still in school. I think we were, I said grimly.
What does Mez do for things like this?
I have no idea. Normally, we'd know what to expect, you know? If it's a bunch of vampires, we get stakes and agents who know how to fight them. You even shoot for 3 agents per vampire when possible. If it's a fire elemental, you get other fire elementals and witches and wizards who are good with fire spells. I don't know what magics or weapons even work against blood magic. Can a wizard fight a blood wizard 1-on-1? 2-on-1? I shook my head. I don't know if anyone has any idea how to proceed.
Please be careful if they send you back out there.
I will.
We sat quietly for a little while longer, sipping our coffee. I didn't realize they made more than just vampires. During the war, I mean, Jen said. I nodded.
Yeah.
What did John say? Banshees?
And berserkers. Zombies, too.
Zombies? She demanded. Like zombies?
Not quite. These were living people. They just had their minds erased. Completely, that is, until they were just going on pure instinct. They were turned loose in enemy camps and villages, and they'd just wander around looking for food. If they thought you were a threat, they defended themselves.
She stared at me, stunned.
They're extinct now,
Rack said.
Yeah, I said. They didn't know friend from foe, so they started roaming right back to their creators and wreaking havoc. And once people figured out that they could only spread their mind wipes through contact, they just fought them from afar. They were gone before the war ended. Same with the Banshees.
What did they do? Jen asked.
They screamed. I chuckled. Their screams didn't kill people, but supposedly rendered them completely helpless. Banshees also couldn't reproduce, so there was only a finite number, and once people figured out how to combat the screams, they were wiped out too.
And, Jen paused.
Berserkers, I told her. They're still around.
What are they like?
Nothing to mess with, that's for sure. They're not as strong or fast as vampires, but quite a bit stronger and faster than other kinds of magics. They're also tough. They heal fast and can fight through injuries that would kill most people. And they have this venom in their claws that causes excruciating pain and paralysis.
Jen looked alarmed, so I quickly added,
They're pretty rare, and they can't turn people.
That's a relief. She frowned. How can you know so much about all those magics created by blood magic, but not blood magic itself?
I guess, like John said, people tried to eradicate it. All the stuff you hear about banshees and zombies is why not to use blood magic.
She nodded. Makes sense?
Mail's here,
I said as I heard the truck slowing down.
Didn't you want to mail a letter to Rachel?
Jen sighed. No, I didn't finish it. I don't know what to write. I gave her a sympathetic hug. It must have been hard to try and keep a non-magic in her life without being able to tell the truth. A little guilt gnawed at me for turning Shannon. Then again, she would have died if I hadn't. And since she was one of Tethys's other soul pack mates, he would have probably died with her. With our strange bond, if he died, I shivered. I hated to admit it, but the way I felt as they were both dying, I didn't think I would have made it either. The sound of yet another car rolling up the driveway caught my attention. This one unfamiliar. Food's here. I started to stand, but Jen waved me back down. I can get it.
You ordered half a deer for TS,
I reminded her. She laughed. Okay, that one might be a bit hard to manage. Together, we headed for the door to get lunch. Chapter 5. Jen. For the next few days, things at Mez were wild. Rumors were flying about what happened in the park. Thomas said he could hardly get any work done once the frightening marks faded and he went back to work, thanks to the steady stream of people wanting to talk to him. When everything finally began to die down, there was an air of unease. Nobody was sure what to make of the threat of blood magic. It seemed like half of my coworkers weren't even convinced it was blood magic. Like Thomas and the others, I did my best to try and carry out business as usual. A couple of weeks later, even the tension faded, and I went into work, ready and hoping for another normal day at the office. Of course, my new normal was studying tons of policy manuals and practical tests now that my first 90 days as an intern were over. Instead of lunches in the break room, I switched over to using an empty classroom so that I had a quiet place to study. Sometimes I ate alone there. Other times a friend or two joined me. I said goodbye to Rack as he headed off to eat with a couple of other familiars before heading upstairs. The IT department was on the way to the classroom, so I stopped by and poked my head in.
"Hey, Jen,"
Ember said from her desk. "Did you want to grab lunch together?" I asked.
"Yeah, sure. I could use a break anyway."
She stood and stretched, then grabbed her laptop.
"I'll be back. See you, Charlotte." "Bye, Ember,"
I heard the Dampier answer. "Oh," I said, hoping she didn't feel left out. "Hi, Charlotte."
"Hi,"
she said. I followed Ember out of the IT office and into the copy room where she stopped by a locker to grab a log, then followed me into the hall. "I didn't hurt Charlotte's feelings, did I?" I asked as soon as I was confident we were too far for Dampier ears. "By not inviting her?"
"I don't think so,"
Ember said.
"She kind of keeps to herself anyway. I mean, I try to be nice and include her, but we don't talk about much besides work. I think she's still adjusting to being a magic."
"Yeah, it's a big change. Do you think she's lonely?"
"She's got a non-magic sister she talks to a lot. I figure she's probably trying to spend as much time with her as possible before she has to."
Ember trailed off and winced. Her eyes dimmed and smoldered. "Sorry. Spoke before a thought." "It's okay." I was quite familiar with the fire elemental tendency to blurt things out, but it was a painful reminder of my own similar situation. I wondered if Charlotte's sister was closer to her in age than my half-sister. At 14, Emily was finally old enough to exchange meaningful, readable emails and actually talk with. In some ways, that was making it harder to imagine withdrawing from her life than it was when she had been younger. Mariana was already in the classroom, eating lunch and reading a book. The three of us talked for a bit while we ate. Then Ember set up her laptop, and I settled in with my latest study materials. I had the afternoon blocked off to review some guidelines, so I'd be in the classroom for the rest of the day. Ember could do most of her job from her laptop, so her boss didn't care if she vanished from time to time, which meant she could stay with me. Mariana, still pushing to actually get real work, was happy to leave accounting for a while. She hoped that Peridot would notice she was gone and realize she needed more to do. We hadn't been finished eating for long when the last person I expected walked in.
"John!"
Ember yelped in surprise. John was like a father to Thomas, so the rest of us thought of him as a father figure as well, but he was still the chief of our field office. In fact, John was the head of the entire northeast region of Mez.
Father or not, when your boss walks in and you're slacking, you get uncomfortable. Granted, I was supposed to be studying, but I still felt awkward sitting off in an unused classroom. If he would have preferred us at our respective workplaces, he didn't show it. Instead, he bowed.
"Good afternoon. I'm pleased to find the three of you together. This will save me some time."
"You are a bit hard to find, though," Fend chimed in. "What can we do for you?" Mariana asked, starting to stand.
"Please, sit."
John crossed the room and sat at a desk of his own. For a moment, he tapped his fingers on it, looking just uneasy enough to concern me. At last, he spoke.
"I must confess, I am quite frustrated."
Ember, Mariana, and I exchanged nervous glances.
"A number of rumors regarding the incident in Allegheny State Park have been going around. I trust the agents involved have told the three of you the full events as they truly happened."
We nodded. John sighed.
"The situation in Allegheny State Park has become too severe to allow it to continue unchecked. We must stop investigating each disappearance as a separate case. I believe we need to search the entire park until we uncover those responsible."
He took a deep breath.
"Yet, blood magic is not something to be taken lightly. I will not needlessly endanger my agents again. The four of them are lucky to be alive."
He looked pained for a moment, and I knew he was thinking of Thomas.
"I do not say this due to my affection for Thomas, as well as Danio and Tethys. I say this because they are some of my best agents. Agent Fletcher is exemplary as well. They were incapacitated in moments. I cannot, and will not, send so few agents into the park again. I need more."
"They're not the only 4 who work here," Ember blurted.
"No," John said in agreement. "But that is still not enough. I want to launch a massive, unprecedented investigation into the park with as many agents from the entire region as I can get. No office can spare their entire crew, nor do I expect them to. However, I feel a large team of agents from every regional field office would be enough to scour the woods with minimal casualties."
He laced his fingers together and paused, eyes slightly narrowed.
"I have spent the last several days consulting with the heads of the field offices. To my great frustration, nearly half of them will not send agents."
"Don't they have to?" Mariana asked. "You're their boss."
Honestly, I was wondering the same thing. A small smile crossed John's lips.
"I'm afraid that's not entirely accurate. My job is primarily administrative. I'm in charge of coordination between offices, allocating funds and resources, or facilitating communication. I'm the main point of contact, or representative if multiple field offices are involved, among other duties. While I am briefed and involved in the day-to-day operations of every field office, each one is autonomously operated by its own branch manager. I have the final say in many matters, including personnel in regards to hiring or transfers. I do not have the authority to assign agents to field work, with the exception of this office, because I also continue to serve as the branch manager here."
"Oh," Mariana said. Ember and I echoed her.
"I can request the agents needed, as I outlined to the other branch managers in my plan, but they have every right to refuse. Unfortunately, this leaves my hands tied. Without the cooperation of nearly every field office in the region, a large-scale investigation is too dangerous. I would simply be putting even more lives at risk instead of giving us an advantage.
Why are they refusing? I asked.
Some believe, as I do, that this calls for a large-scale investigation and recognize the risk should we go in without enough agents. As such, they refuse to join unless the number of other offices who are willing is high enough. Others do not believe the situation is serious enough to require assistance from other branches, he said.
People are vanishing left and right, cried Ember. And now there's blood magic? How can they not think it's serious?
John inclined his head to her in a single nod.
They are not all convinced the missing persons are connected. Some do not believe the blood magic is connected, and others are not certain there is blood magic involved at all. They want evidence.
But,
Ember began. John held up a hand, and she fell silent.
There is no evidence, Ember. Both our theory and these disappearances are related, and our belief that blood magic is involved are based solely on conjecture. The fact is, we do not have evidence to prove it.
He shook his head.
As it happens, were I in their position, I would be hesitant to provide assistance as well. I am asking them to take their best agents away from local incidents, leave their offices short-handed, and send those same agents into unknown danger. I cannot fault them for wanting to know more.
He took a deep breath and frowned. Fend jumped onto his shoulder and nibbled his ear affectionately.
And yet,
John went on,
there are some who are asking for evidence because they know I cannot get it. I will not send my people back in there until we know more.
But you can't learn more without sending agents in,
Mariana groaned.
Sounds like assholes to me,
Ember snorted.
You can understand my frustration,
said John, spreading his hands helplessly.
Which brings me to why I am here. I need your help.
The three of us looked at each other in confusion. Who was he talking to?
All three of you,
John clarified.
I need your help.
To do what?
Asked Ember.
I need evidence to prove these cases are connected.
You want us to go to the park? I asked.
No,
John said quickly.
No, absolutely not. I refuse to send my top agents to the park without more information. I certainly would not send a couple of young employees and an intern in their place.
Then how are we supposed to find evidence?
Ember asked. And why us? I added. John smiled.
Because the three of you are in a unique position to assist me.
We exchanged confused and skeptical looks.
First, I trust each of you. Do not misunderstand. I trust everyone in my employ. But there are some who work here who are more, shall we say, mercenary. I trust them to do their jobs. Yet they are also happy to seize opportunities when the outcomes benefit them. There are some field office heads who asked me for evidence, not only knowing I cannot provide it, but because they do not want me to provide it. You all know how rumors make their way around the office. Those same rumors reach other field offices as well. If word spreads that I am launching a preliminary investigation to collect evidence in order to convince other heads to join, it could lead to complications. including some which could jeopardize the mass investigation itself. I trust the three of you to be discreet. In fact, you may not relay this conversation or what I ask of you to anyone."
"What about—" Ember began.
Once again, John held up a hand, this time with a wry smile.
"Except, of course, your father's."
He nodded towards me.
"Thomas and Tethys as well. The four of them just happen to be the agents I trust completely, both to keep this discreet as you will, and to not use it in any way against me."
I swallowed nervously. There were certainly plenty of tricky policies and co-worker relationships to navigate at Mez, but I hadn't realized there was so much happening between offices. "What do you expect us to do?" I asked.
"You, Jennifer,"
John said,
"are an intern. This means you have access to everything. You are free to go anywhere. You can ask anyone for whatever information you need and take anything you like from the filing room without suspicion. You also have a great deal of study time in your schedule, which allows you to work on this with access to the full resources in the office without taking you away from your regular duties."
He turned toward Mariana.
"We do understand you have to study, Chen-chan."
Fend spoke up suddenly. John flashed his familiar a smile, and I suspected he had forgotten to say it. John nodded to me.
"I will make sure you are allowed allotted additional time if it becomes an issue. Now, Mariana," he turned to her, "while I understand your frustration with Peridot's management style, and I will be speaking to her regarding her difficulty in designating work for you, it works in our favor now, as you too have time to assist me. You are also skilled in analyzing and finding patterns in data. This is exactly what I need."
"What about me?"
asked Ember.
"You, Ember, are critical for the success of this. You have access to the whole of the Mez database. You can generate any reports you need and view any files. Better yet, you can use the IT side of things to access files without leaving evidence behind."
John smiled for a moment, then his face fell.
"I confess, I do not know what I am looking for, yet I must produce something, and that is where you three come in. Find me evidence that these disappearances are related, by more than just location. I need to prove that it is not coincidence, but an unknown force taking them. Some people have suggested that these missing persons are vanishing on purpose, either to start anew elsewhere or to take their own lives. I want proof this is not the case. I need something concrete that will convince enough of the heads that an investigation is warranted and critical. I want this done quickly, but thoroughly."
With that, John slowly rose and bowed deeply.
"Yoroshiku onegaishimasu."
Chapter 6. Jen.
"Well,"
Mariana said, after the three of us had recovered from John's surprise visit,
"I guess we should get started."
She closed her book and rested her chin in one hand.
"But where do we even start?"
I shut my binder and leaned back in my chair. We need to prove that these disappearances are connected somehow. I'm not even sure how many people have gone missing. I've only been here for a few months. How long has this been going on?
"It's been years,"
Mariana said.
"I'm pretty sure someone vanished right around when I started my internship,"
Ember said.
And that was over 5 years ago. So, I guess the first thing to do, Mariana said, is figure out just how many people have gone missing.
I can do that easily enough. Ember opened the laptop she had closed upon John's arrival and began typing. I can generate a report to bring up everyone whose status has been set to missing in the last, 10 years?
10 sounds good,
Mariana said. One thing, though, said Ember. We have to remember not everyone who comes back as missing went missing in the park. So we're going to have to go through the activity log in each file to see who was reported missing there. Here we go. Oh. She frowned, and I saw her eyes flare. What is it? I asked. 10 years ago, she said softly. There was one person reported missing to our field office. 9 years ago, there were none. 8 years ago, there was one. She looked up and glanced at us. 7 years ago, there were 8. Mariana and I looked at each other.
That's a big jump, Mariana said. What about 6 years ago?
Ember looked at the computer. 11, then 9, then 14, 12, 10, 13, and then 6 so far this year.
Can you do 20 years back? Mariana asked.
Yeah, hang on. Ember shook her head after a moment. Wow.
Well?
Mariana echoed. 20 years ago? No disappearances, Ember said. Then 1, 3, none, 1, 1, 2, none, and 1. We all looked at each other grimly. I know this isn't enough proof, Ember said, but I think it's clear something is happening. These numbers shouldn't jump like that unless something... She shrugged. Something changed 7 years ago in the park.
Well, one thing we have to do, Mariana said, is make sure that these additional disappearances can be attributed to the park and aren't being caused by something else.
What else could it be? Ember asked before I could. Mariana shrugged one shoulder.
Maybe the way they classify missing persons changed 7 years ago, so now there are more. Or maybe they pulled out some old files in the Digitize the Filing Room project, and any old cases they added are being counted as recent.
Both plausible, Ember said with a grimace. And happened before I started here, so I can't say for sure. Can we check everywhere? I asked. By, field office or something? If we're the only ones with a huge increase, then it must be something here, right? And not something related to the database? Absolutely, said Ember. For a couple of minutes, the only sound in the room was clicking, both from Ember's keyboard and from her as she chattered to herself in Sedaic, the fire elemental language. Okay, she said at last. There are hundreds of field offices, so I broke it down by region. The numbers are, of course, a lot bigger, but I've got another column here with a plus-minus breakdown when compared to the previous year. So, Southeast 8 years ago saw 6 more disappearances than the previous year. 7 years ago, they saw 4 less than that. Mid-Atlantic saw 5 less, and then 3 more. Could that one be at all influenced by the people who were abducted for the facility? I asked. Mariana shuddered at the reminder. The 2 of us had been captured and brought to a place simply called the facility a few years ago. We were lucky to escape with our lives. I don't think so, Ember said. Mez was able to identify everyone who was taken, so none of them should be listed as missing. She studied her screen for a moment.
And I don't see anything too crazy in the mid-Atlantic numbers, but she glanced up at us. Our region was -2 8 years ago, and then it was +23. It doesn't drop back down again, and none of the other regions have jumps like that. So it is just here, I said. I wasn't sure if I was happy to confirm that or not. Wait, Mariana said. Did you say +23? Ember nodded and Mariana frowned. What was it that year for just our office? Ember checked. 8. She frowned too. Then where are the others coming from? Mariana asked. Maybe it's not just us. We sat quietly, thinking. My mind wandered back to my experience at the facility, and the pieces fell into place. Oh! I gasped. They both jumped a little, and I spotted a couple of sparks fly from Ember's fingers. It's just like when I was taken. It is? Ember asked. When I was kidnapped and brought to the facility, nobody knew where I was, I reminded her. So, if Thomas hadn't already been looking for me, my disappearance would have been reported to my local Mez office in Maryland, not the one in West Virginia where I ended up. Mariana caught on immediately. Of course. These people are going missing in the park, but nobody knows they're there, so they're being reported to their local offices and not us. That makes sense, Ember agreed. Okay, then. So what I need to do is run another report of everyone missing in our region for, let's do 10 years, just in case. This will take a little longer, though. I have to run to my office to print it. We'll need the activity logs. What else? There's a printer in here, Mariana said. Ember shook her head. I have to do it on the back end. It must have been obvious that Mariana and I weren't sure why. Ember giggled and explained. So, the Mez database has two, sides to it. The front end is what you guys see. It has all the files and info and stuff. But in IT, we can see the back end. It has way more details and information in it. I can run some simple reports and see stuff in the front end, but in order to get one with the activity logs from other field offices, I have to use the back end, and that can only be accessed from a hardwired computer, like my desktop in the IT office. She drummed her fingers against the desk, releasing tiny sparks as she did. Other than the basic profile info and activity logs, is there anything else I should grab? Is there anything else that could prove a connection? I asked. It's one thing to show a bunch of people are missing there, but John wants us to find a connection between them. And to prove they aren't going missing on purpose, Mariana added. I frowned. I had caught that bit when John said it. I don't understand that, I confessed. I mean, I get that some of them might be going in there to die, but what did he mean by start anew? Some old magics get bored, Mariana said. I guess they've just been doing the same thing for so long. Instead of changing jobs or moving, they just change their entire lives. They change their names, lie about their ages, and just go somewhere totally different and start a brand new life as, I guess, a new person. She shrugged. It's possible some of them might see the park as a good place to vanish, but I can't imagine just letting your family think you were missing or dead. My brother died decades ago, and my parents are still crushed. I didn't know what to say. I tried to recall if Mariana had ever mentioned a brother before. She noticed and flashed me a weak smile. I never knew him, so I guess I don't bring him up much.
I didn't want to ask how, but she told me anyway.
He got killed in Vietnam.
That caught my attention. Her brother wasn't the only magic I knew who spent time there. In the war? I asked.
Yeah.
Mariana smiled grimly.
That's how I met Danny. They served together.
I'm sorry, I offered. I wondered how well he and Danny had known each other and added it to my small mental list of what I knew about Danny's past. He rarely volunteered information about it, and the more I learned, the more I understood why. Mariana nodded sadly.
Anyway,
she said quickly,
we should also try to prove these people are not going into the park planning on never coming back.
But with what information? Ember asked. It was clear she already knew, unsurprisingly, about Mariana's brother, but I had a feeling she found the topic uncomfortable. I pushed Mariana's brother out of my mind and tried to think about what other information the database contained that could help us. But I couldn't shake the surprise that some magics got so bored they literally started their lives over. I couldn't imagine it. I also couldn't picture just leaving everything behind. In fact, wouldn't people planning on starting a new life bring something? I asked. I mean, they aren't just going to go off somewhere else with just the clothes on their backs. They'd have to bring a few supplies. Food, money, spare clothes.
Money!
Mariana cried.
Of course.
She turned eagerly to Ember.
Can you print accounting records?
I think so. Why?
Jen's right. If these people are going missing on purpose, they'd probably withdraw a bunch of cash first. But...
Mariana paused, and I could almost see the wheels turning.
And if they were just camping, they may have gone to a sporting goods store or something, or even rented a kayak or an inner tube. Yes, we could use transactions to help figure out if some of them were going to the park. They might even have made purchases at local gas stations or stores, or,
she went on excitedly,
maybe some shopped at the same places. We could find a connection there.
Done, Ember said. Accounting records. Anything else? We kept brainstorming, but that was all we could come up with. It was late enough that Mariana and Ember were going to need to go back to their desks. Even with John's blessing, we decided we wanted to try and keep as low of a profile as possible and stick to our usual schedules if we could. Ember said it would probably take a couple of hours to compile and print everything anyway, so we made plans to regroup after our shifts were over. Mariana was happy to drive us home, and if it took even longer, Danny and Thomas would both be coming in for their shift. I reported back to my supervisor and finished off the day at the front desk, filling rack in on everything between phone calls. When my shift ended, the two of us went to welcome Thomas and T.S. to their shift and let them know we were staying. I told them I was working on a project and promised to explain it later. Soon enough, I was back in the empty classroom. Mariana joined me next. We were just starting to wonder where Ember was when she returned with a huge armload of paper.
What is all that?
Mariana asked. Profiles, activity logs, and financial information for 10 years worth of missing and dead persons in the entire Northeast region, Ember said from behind the stack.
Dead?
Mariana echoed. Ember dropped her pile on a desk with a resounding thud. I was thinking, she said, dusting off her hands. When I was starting the reports, I remembered a couple of the people who went missing had been reported as dead, so filtering by just missing isn't gonna cover everyone from the park. So, She gestured to her stack. I added dead. It'll be more work, but I think it's better to be thorough. Mariana and I nodded in agreement. Where do we start? I asked, eyeing the massive stack of paper. I figured we sort it first, Ember said. We'll just each grab a handful and put it into 4 piles. 1, park for sure. That's for the ones that actually mention the park in the activity log. 2, not the park. The ones that specifically say they went missing or died somewhere else. 3 is maybe the park. That's the one where they have something in their activity log, like a witness who said they were going camping, or a charge from a sporting goods store or something. And last is probably not the park. Same idea, but for files that don't suggest any outdoor activity. I figure if we end up finding any patterns in the park files, we can pull these out if need be. Sounds like a plan, I said, reaching for the pile. I grabbed a thick bunch of papers and settled into a desk next to Ember's. Mariana dragged a third desk around so we were sitting in a circle and took her own pile. I'd offer to help, Rack said, but that will be a bit hard without thumbs. He settled in on a nearby desk. I am here if you need me, of course. Thanks, Rack, I said. I studied my first file. Status: missing. I flipped to the activity log page. The most recent entries were interviews and case notes. And right there, Allegheny State Park. Park, I said grimly, holding it up. Ember gestured to an empty desk, and I tossed it there. Not park, said Mariana a moment later. She leaned over and set it on a different desk. Maybe park, Ember said with a dry chuckle, setting her file on another desk. We worked in silence for a couple of minutes, developing a somewhat morbid-feeling rhythm for checking files for cause of death or disappearance. I picked up a new file and glanced at the status, then frowned. Hey, Ember, I said, confused. This one is active. What? She asked, eyes flaring. Here. I handed it over. Her eyes dimmed as she studied it, then turned red with annoyance. I know what this is. Lazy, dehydrated IT idiots at work. What do you mean? I asked. Ember thought for a moment. Well, okay. Actually, perfect example. So, say you accidentally changed this guy's status to missing. Now there's a record in the activity log showing it, along with your name. You have to set it back to active, which adds another entry, and then you have to attach a note to the entry explaining that the status changes were accidents, right? I nodded. As it happened, the regulations for adding entries to the activity log were quite fresh in my mind, seeing as I had had to update the appropriate files every time I spoke with someone on the phone. Some people think that accidental entries make them look bad or something. Ember rolled her eyes. So they ask someone in the IT department to delete the log entirely. I was told we aren't allowed to delete stuff, I said. You're not. And technically, neither is IT. Ember shrugged. But sometimes, instead of bothering to explain that, some IT people go ahead and do it anyway. The problem... She paused and pursed her lips. Remember the front end and the back end, right? If you change someone's status to missing in the front end and save it, then it triggers a bunch of automated sequences. One of those is automatically adding the change entry to the activity log, but there are like 20 other things, out of sight, that all get updated on the back end. If you do it properly and change it back to active, then all those things happen again. Following? Mariana and I nodded.
If someone from IT is asked to fix it the wrong way, then they'll go in through the back end and manually change the status to active and then go to the activity log and delete the record. Problem is that it don't trigger the sequence, so those other 20 things don't get updated and they stay set for missing. Most of the time, that won't be a problem, just 'cause everything looks right on the front end. But if you run a report, like I just did, then they'll screw up the system and show up.
Annoying, Mariana said.
Luckily, it doesn't happen that often, I don't think, Ember said. She clutched the file in her hand, and it started to smoke.
Actually,
her eyes flared, and the tiny flame at the edge of the paper died. Instead, she tucked the paper under her chair.
I should probably fix it.
Who does that?
Asked Mariana in annoyance.
No way to say in the back end, but my best guess is all the older magics who knew nothing about IT before they ended up there and don't know any better, Ember said, wrinkling her nose. She reached for another file.
Oh well, moving on.
I did the same, and we each sorted a few more files.
Ember?
Mariana said suddenly.
I have another active one.
Ashes, really?
Ember took it from her and glared at it. She flipped through a couple of pages, clicking to herself. Then she frowned.
Huh. She hasn't had any new activity in 6 years.
That's not so unusual, is it? I was fairly sure I saw plenty of files with big gaps. Most activity logs weren't updated unless the person interacted with Mez somehow.
I suppose not, Ember agreed. Guess I'm just paranoid.
She stuck it under her chair and grabbed another file.
Active, she cried the moment she looked at it. You've gotta be kidding me.
When was the last activity?
Mariana asked. Less than a year ago, Ember said. At that moment, I found another. I have one too, I said. I flipped to the activity log. 2 years. I was about to hand it to Ember when I glanced at the most recent entry and pulled it back to me. Wait, this is a vampire.
So?
Mariana asked. I thought back to the day, not long after I started my internship, that I sat down with Thomas and looked over his file while I learned my way around the database. His activity log was jam-packed, and he explained how it worked. Every time a vampire comes to feed at Mez, they scan their ID, and it's automatically added to the activity log, I said. According to the log, this guy hasn't come here to feed in 2 years.
So he's either feeding illegally and hasn't been caught, or,
said Mariana. Or he really is missing, Ember said darkly. And someone changed his file to cover it up. Rack jumped up next to me and looked at the file. Does it have the pending... What did Thomas call it? Pending email sequence, I said, looking back at the file. Vampires were also supposed to have an entry in their activity log that was queued up to send a notification to the local feeding coordinator, in our case, Thomas, to let them know if a vampire failed to check in or sign up to feed. No, I don't see it. Would those have printed, Ember? She nodded. Yes, pending sequences should be there. If it's not, then someone removed it so the coordinator isn't notified.
Don't you think Thomas would notice if someone didn't show up to feed?
Mariana asked. Let's find out, I said, pulling out my phone to call him. He answered quickly. Hey, Jen, heading home? Not yet. I have a question about your job. Your project sounds fascinating, he said dryly.
What is it?
If the email sequence that alerts you when a vampire doesn't feed was, accidentally deleted from the database, would you notice? I switched it to speaker so the others could hear.
Probably not,
Thomas said after a moment. You wouldn't check? I asked.
Honestly, no. I remember having to track all of that on paper, and it was a huge amount of work. I don't know how I ever found the time. And I wasn't even a special agent back then. I don't have the time to... How do I put this? I can't take time away from my other work to double-check that something which is supposed to be automated is functioning properly. Of course, I'd feel awful if that did happen. Then again, if the sequence got deleted, then that vampire wouldn't get the feeding notification emails either. So I imagine they'd reach out to us and the error would be found pretty quickly.
I glanced up at Ember, who nodded in agreement. What if, I asked, the vampire didn't want to feed? Legally, I mean. Thomas was silent for a minute.
I don't think that would happen,
he said finally.
Sure, there are vampires like that, obviously. But unless they work for Mez, the average vampire doesn't know about the email sequence in the database and how it works. If there was an error in the tracking, they wouldn't know about it to take advantage of it.
Ember leaned forward, closer to my phone. Okay, so what if that did happen? Wouldn't you notice if someone is missing fade-ins, though? In person?
Oh, hi, Ember.
Thomas chuckled.
I'm afraid I wouldn't know. I don't go to feedings.
You don't?
Most of them are at night when I'm working. I drop in to feed on my break, but I don't go there to supervise or anything. Besides, there are so many vampires and dampiers in the area, I don't know if I'd remember them all well enough to keep track of who is where, especially considering feedings can be a little irregular.
I think that's all we need to know, I said. Ember and Mariana nodded. Thanks.
Any time?
He said, sounding skeptical. After I hung up, the three of us looked at each other somberly. So, what if, Ember said, tapping the vampire's file, this guy really is missing, and someone changed his file to cover it up? Well, we know nobody would notice if the email sequence was removed, I added. What about those other ones? Mariana asked. Are they all vampires? Ember pulled the active status files out from under her chair. Werewolf, dampier, and an air elemental. She pulled out one and studied it. The dampier was active, just about 9 months ago, but her sequences are deleted too. Let's sort the rest of these and see how many more are like that, Mariana suggested. Then we can go through all of them like we planned, looking for connections. We nodded in agreement, and the three of us returned to sorting. We stopped long enough to take a dinner break, but none of us really seemed to feel like eating. Going through the printouts of the missing and dead was grim work. We were finally close to the end when someone knocked gently on the door. John came in and closed it behind him.
I heard the three of you were still here,
he said, nodding toward Rack.
And Rack, good evening. I must apologize. I did not intend for this task to keep you here so late after your shifts.
We wanted to stay, Ember said with a shrug. At least until all of this is sorted.
I see. May I ask what you have so far?
John asked, studying our large stacks. We explained the criteria we started with and how we were sorting it all.
Well done, John said. I believe the three of you were best suited to this task, and now I see I was correct.
He narrowed his eyes.
I regret that it is necessary, especially given what you have already uncovered. This is indeed serious.
There's something else, Ember said. She told him about the strange active files we found that had been altered.
Concerning, John said when she was done. Extremely concerning.
He frowned in thought.
Do you know yet if they are connected to the park?
We shook our heads.
We haven't sat down to compare them yet,
Mariana said.
John nodded. The park is our priority. I don't want to take too much time away from it, but this matter is worth exploring, especially if there is a connection. Ember, I want you to check the database again to make sure there are no additional altered files, if that is possible. If you do find a connection between these and the park, then it will be worth the additional time. If not, set them aside, but expect to return to them when the matter in the park is resolved. I will need the three of you to explore that as well. I thank you again.
He dipped his head in a small bow, then turned to leave.
Ne, Hideki,
Vand said. He spoke quickly and quietly in Japanese, perched on John's shoulder, so I couldn't understand much of it.
Ah,
John agreed softly. He turned back to us.
I said before this requires discretion.
We nodded.
Given what you have uncovered, keeping this secret is of the utmost importance. If these files have been altered to conceal additional disappearances, then it was done by one of our own at Mez.
We were so busy sorting and trying to figure things out, it hadn't even occurred to me. I could have slapped myself. Of course, it was someone at Mez.
Ashes,
Ember cried.
You're right. The only way to make those changes is in the back end. You'd have to have a hardwire computer and IT access.
Her eyes flared, and her normally sunburn-red face paled.
Do you think it's someone here? In my office?
I do not know,
John said.
Certainly someone in our region, I would think. Be careful, all of you. We must not let whoever is responsible for this know that we have uncovered it.
Once he was gone, we all sighed and looked nervously at our stacks of paper.
All those people,
Mariana said softly.
And someone at Mez could be behind it?
I shuddered. I hadn't worked here long, but I always felt comfortable walking the halls. Everyone seemed so friendly. Rack yawned, which made me yawn. Somehow it broke the tension, and we all giggled. Mariana yawned too.
How long have we been here?
She groaned.
I hate to say it, but I don't think I'm going to make it until Danny's shift is over, and I don't know how much longer I'm going to feel like driving either.
Tell you what, Ember said. Why don't you two finish sorting these? I'll go see if I can figure out how to print any other altered files, and bring them back if I do. Once it's all sorted, we can head out. We nodded, and she stood.
Oh, maybe I'll call Callan and ask him,
she said as she started to leave. Who's Callan? I asked. And can we trust... The door closed behind her.
We can,
Mariana said. I turned to her curiously.
He's married to one of Danny's good friends from the Legion.
Why is she calling him? Mariana laughed.
He's one of the best Mez hackers in the country, and I'm pretty sure he wrote the code for the database, or at least some of it. If anyone knows their way around it, it's him.
Let's get to sorting, then, I said. If Ember and Mariana trusted him, I assumed Danny did too, and that was good enough for me. We were just about done when Ember came back with another huge stack of paper.
"Oh, no," Mariana cried. "There are that many?"
"Not quite." Ember navigated her way to a desk and set them down.
"Why are they burned?"
Mariana asked with a laugh. Sure enough, there was a big charred spot on the side of the stack. Rack sniffed a little. I did too, and could just smell a touch of smoke. Ember sighed.
"I'm so friggin' jumpy, thinking that someone in IT is covering all this up. Charlotte was doing a double today, and she came over to see why I was here so late and startled me so much I set it on fire."
She frowned at the papers.
"I don't think I singed any words, though."
"So, what is all that?" I asked.
"Well, according to Callan,
Ember stopped and laughed.
Sorry, almost got technical on you there. Basically, there are, redundancies and backup files in the system. Callan walked me through how to find accounts that have different information on the back end than what is showing on the front end and print them. This stack is actually 2 files per person." She held up 2 little packets. One is their file as it appears in the front end, and the other is what we have in the back end, with... She flipped it open and pointed to some red text. "Automatic changes highlighted. All we have to do is see what's read, and that shows us what was removed or altered." "Perfect,"
cried Mariana. I yawned again.
"What now?"
"I guess we go home and pick up tomorrow," Ember said with a shrug. "Wait, shoot, I'm off tomorrow," I said. "I could come in." Ember shook her head. "I think John wants us to act as normal as possible. Even us staying late like this is kind of weird. We should try to stick to our schedules as much as we can."
"I'm off too," Mariana said. "And I'm supposed to have lunch with my parents."
"I'm working," Ember groaned. "Go ahead and have lunch and..." "Can we split these up somehow?" I asked. "I could take a stack and go over it at home."
"I'll help if I can," offered Rack.
"That should work," said Mariana. "It's all sorted, so now we need to try to find connections and patterns, right? If we each take some and do that, we can write down anything similar or strange that we find and then compare notes. I'll take some too and come over after lunch."
"Toasty. Then I'll keep some here and look at it when I can while I'm working," Ember said. "Let's see. Why don't you guys take these?" She tapped the top of the newest stack of papers. "If these really were altered by someone at Mez, we don't want to get caught with them here." "I'll take those," I volunteered. "I sorted them so our pile of active but missing people weren't printed again," Ember said. "Why don't you grab those, Mariana, and I'll take the rest." "There are a lot," I said, not wanting Ember to have more to do, especially since she'd be working too. "I'll start with the park and the maybe park ones. I can probably just use not park as a snack." She chuckled. "And then the probably not park I can go over once I have patterns from the others. It's not too many." "Sounds like a plan," I said. The 3 of us gathered up our stacks and headed to the parking garage. I texted Thomas to let him know we were leaving, and we piled into Mariana's car. "Thanks for the lift," Ember said.
"Sure thing."
We drove in somber silence for a while. I didn't know about them, but I was thinking about the daunting, somewhat depressing task ahead of us. As we got closer to Ember's house, Mariana broke the silence.
"How's moving in going?"
Mariana asked.
"It's great,"
cried Ember.
The house is amazing.
I leaned back, grateful for the light-hearted new subject. After a couple of decades in the same small house they bought after moving in together, Danny and Charlie had decided to buy some land and get a custom house built. Construction had finished shortly after my internship began, and we were all eagerly checking out the new house. It was set in the woods like Thomas's, with an even larger pond, as well as a little stable and a blacksmith shed for Ember and Charlie. The property was also within walking distance of the river Danny used to visit his family in Michigan. The house had a bunch of weird perks for elementals, too, like a shallow, hardly more than an inch deep, stream that wound around the main level, so Danny could stand in water whenever he liked. The floors were all made of fireproof tile. They also didn't have a single rug, aside from a doormat, anywhere. Fire elementals were prone to scorching them, and since water elementals matched the temperature of their environment, Danny wouldn't even notice if the floors were cold. After a couple of direction reminders from Ember, we pulled up in front of the large house. It looked like a little landscaping had been done since I was here last. Ember collected her papers, said goodnight, and headed in. Mariana drove me back home, and Rack and I went inside with our own stack. She promised to text me once she got home safely. I usually stayed up until Thomas got home, but I was feeling drained by the long, somewhat emotional day, so I took a quick shower and got into bed. Rack curled up on my feet, and I soon fell asleep.